I'm pumped to see what you're both going to bring to the table for tonight, as you've both debated this topic many, many times. So why don't we get acquainted, though, kind of break the ice for anybody who is unfamiliar with you both. Taylor, why don't we start with you? Been a little bit since you've been here. And so how have you been? A little bit about yourself and also a little bit about your channels.
Sure. Yeah, I've been on a bit of a break due to some family health issues, but basically what I do is kind of my channel, Snake Was Right, is really about looking at things through specifically a source method scientific critical eye. And so I tend to come up across religions and things like that. Um, but also politics and things like that. And I also run a channel called Debate Cafe. And what we do there is actually my partner in that is a debate coach, and me and her basically, or guest moderators as well, will what we do differently is we basically critique the debates with as objective a scale as we can. And so not about whether you were right or wrong, but more about how you argued for it. And so that's what I do on YouTube. I majored in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology, so that's my background education. And yeah, I like to focus on source methods and testability of claims, no matter religious or not.
Taylor, thank you very much for that introduction. Good to have you back in the debate octagon, that's for sure. And I've got your links, the relevant links to your channels in the description box for people to check out. Okay, TRock, good to have you back as well. How have you been? And a little bit about yourself.
I've been good. I've been busy. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I take it my sound is still okay. Yeah, so I am a dyed in the wool, so to speak, young Earth creationist, 6,000 years plus or minus a couple hundred years. Evolution is the furthest thing from reality and from real, legitimate scientific method. And so that's what we're going to investigate tonight. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. TRock, thank you for your intro as well. I do have at least one or a couple of your debates linked in the description box for people to check out. And so if you want to see more from Taylor, you want to see more from TRock, do check the description box for the relevant link. So also, reminder before we get into the debate itself, we have a few debates going on in the next several days. And so tonight, of course, is there good evidence for evolution? Tomorrow we have a soteriology showdown. Is free grace theology biblical? Charles Jennings and Lucas Curcio. And then we're going to have TRock. We're keeping you busy. You're going to be back again for a debate with Mark Reed on the Genesis flood. And so the exact title for the third is there scientific evidence for a worldwide flood? So lots for our audience to look forward to. This is June 1st, and I'll say this is the summer of debates. And so we've got a lot for everybody to look forward to, and a lot on different topics too. We got a solid variety for everybody. Okay, let's go over the format for tonight's evolution debate. We'll be starting off with 12-minute opening statements. The question again, is there good scientific evidence for evolution? Taylor would say yes. TRock would say no. And therefore, Snake will kick us off with his opening statement. Then we'll have an 8-minute uninterrupted rebuttal, followed by a discussion. And so the discussion portion, rather than being really strict cross exam, it'll be more free flowing as we typically do in these evolution debates. We want to be comprehensive, and we'll allow Taylor and TRock to discuss the topic. Then we'll have a 5-minute closing statement where the debaters can wrap up their thoughts and points for tonight. And then this is where we get you guys in the audience involved. We'll have a roughly 25 to 30-minute audience Q&A period. And so if you do have an evolution related question, please make sure to tag me either at Donnie or at Standing for Truth. And that way I won't miss them. Okay, let's get right into the first opening statement. Snake was right. Whenever you're ready, just let me know. And you've got 12 minutes.
Sure. Let me just start a timer here just for my own keeping track. And I won't be using slides. I might use them during the debate, but
okay, cool.
So is there good evidence for evolution? Well, nearly all experts, especially in biology, think so. And more, nearly every expert from Darwin's time and shortly thereafter also thought there was enough evidence to convert away from creationism and into evolution. So what is the evidence? We could never cover all of the evidence or even really the main ones that you learn in biology and just a debate tonight. But we can look at some really strong examples. But I think more importantly is to focus on what is actually a good standard for evidence. I think this is kind of what we miss out on a lot of the time. Because we quibble over, is that doesn't count as evidence, or it does, but I think a better approach would be to decide what is the standard for good evidence, and then we can have an objective standard for each piece of evidence that we bring to the table. So as a counterexample for perspective, that we could look at something that has really poor amounts of evidence. So pseudosciences like creationism, for instance, just a random example I pulled out of thin air. But there is zero scientific evidence for it, and tons of preclusionary scientific evidence against it, not least of all the heat problem, which actually just got worse by published data by creationists themselves. And alone, that absolutely precludes creationism, among other things like deposition rates and sheer amount of fossils. The fact that it really all it has, we can put that aside, the preclusionary evidence. We're just looking at evidence for a claim. So really, I guess we could look at preclusionary evidence for evolution. I don't think there is any, but we can talk about what it would be, things like a Precambrian mammal. But creationism, by comparison, only has written claims from an ancient book, which are not testable claims. So this is essentially zero evidence. This is kind of the baseline of comparison here. And evolution has a ton of evidence. And so we can say that this evidence is imperfect or massively incomplete, but that's still infinitely more than zero evidence. So there is evidence for it. And creationism will kind of try and creation science movement will try and poke holes and say, we don't know for 100% certainty that this example or that example is exclusively indicative of evolution. So the conclusion there is, thus, evolution has not proven the case and therefore must be thrown out and has no evidence whatsoever. But that's not a acceptable standard of evidence by any other in any other realm other than pretty much this conversation or other pseudoscientific conversations. We can have evidence without 100% certainty, and we can have evidence that doesn't have 100% certainty as its own data point. So we don't need to have 100% certainty. And each data point doesn't need to have this 100% certainty to have evidence or to have high confidence or to have knowledge. And regardless, we have infinitely more evidence, even if we're going to assume that it's bad evidence, than other pseudosciences. So it's by comparing these two methods that we see there's in fact good evidence for evolution because we can test it. So even if you don't think these tests are 100% indicative, again, they are infinitely superior, which to creationism, which cannot be tested in any way and cannot generate any amount of knowledge. By contrast, evolution does generate knowledge. And the claims can be tested and can be proven wrong. So again, I'm not trying to make this a trial on creationism, but it's about comparing and contrasting. So it's by comparison that we gain perspective. So how did creationists get their information if they didn't test any of it? At best, it's a blind guess, and more likely it's just made up, because if it wasn't, they would have gotten this information by testing it. So if they can't test it, if we can't test it, neither could they, which means it's made up, aka not observed in the world. So in real science, we actually test the claim and we can see the applicable results. We know that cell phone engineers know what they're doing because they make working cell phones. So if evolution works, then its conclusions should work by the same token. And to give another analogy, things like evidence for murder trials, eyewitness testimony, about 52% of wrongful convictions in the US are attributable to errors in eyewitness testimony. So eyewitness testimony is the worst possible form of evidence. It's subject to the most errors. It's subject to lies. It's subject to changes over time if that testimony is handed down. We don't even know if the Bible is actual testimony, but it's usually claimed to be. So baseline, the contender to evolution has the worst possible standard of evidence. So evolution already is leagues ahead. But let's look at the definition of science to, again, have a standard. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines, this is part of the definition, quote, the scientific method requires a logic as a system of reasoning for properly arranging, but also inferring beyond what is known by observation. Methods of reasoning may include induction, prediction, or analogy, among others. So evolution does science, and I mean that literally. The theory itself does science, or hypothesis, if you will, in that it can be used as a scientific tool. So scientists can make predictions and draw actual working knowledge from it, not just conclusions that are floating in the ether that are untestable, but actual testable knowledge. And the applicability of that knowledge is also a test. So another test would be cross confirmation, which means that if you're using multiple different methods and they all come to the same conclusion, like you've probably been in a test before and you've done your math and you think, I don't know about this number. I know how to perform these calculations in a different way. And if you do that different way and you still come up with the same numbers, you have now confirmed it's very likely that the first way that I did it is right. So evolution's cross-confirmed by nuclear physics, thermodynamics, chemistry, mathematics, archaeology, geology, paleontology, comparative genomics, and comparative anatomy, among several others that I haven't even mentioned. It has numerous predictions to its name, predictions of biological functions, predictions of functions of things after we strip some of their functions, predictions of their functions after we let them evolve. We actually observe evolution happening. That's one thing. I'll get to that again in a minute. There's also fossil predictions that no other method is able to do except evolution. So this is let's say there's something wrong with the theory of evolution. It's still the most powerful method that we can use to make these predictions, and thus that is good evidence. There's uses in technology. There's computing technology. There's genetic technology. There's I guess that would count as medicine. There's also virology. There's applications of evolution in medicine and virology. But as well as evolution simulators can also create highly specified complexity. TRock, I think you said in one of your debates that randomness cannot do what intelligent design can do. And you're right, because randomness can do a hell of a lot more than intelligent design can do. We all probably know what ChatGPT is by now. That's done with evolutionary algorithms. It would be impossible for us to create that with intelligent design. That's why we use evolutionary algorithms, because we can't design these things intelligently. It's too complex. High complexity is a hallmark of evolutionary complexity, evolutionary processes, not intelligent design. Mutation and selection is really the only way we can do these AI type projects, as well as we have actual simulation of like body plan type evolution simulators. So this theory of evolution produces actual real results, and all objections to evolution are just an argument from ignorance fallacy. So we can't really do with anything with that. Fallacies don't mean anything. So we have gaps in scientific knowledge and we fill them with God. That's not useful at all. More importantly than it just being a logical fallacy is it actually produces no knowledge. There is no technology, no medicine, no predictions coming from the alternatives to evolution. So it is, in that sense, more powerful. And that's not even talking about the specific data points like endogenous retroviruses, which make it mathematically impossible for things to have not evolved due to the fact that there's no design reason for it. If God wanted us to believe otherwise, it would be easy to scramble them. But instead, we have only what we'd expect from evolution. So basically, we also agree that evolution happens. We observe it. We agree that it happens to some degree. So basically, you're saying we can walk 10 feet, but not 1,000. You can say we can evolve a little bit, but not as much as you want to say. So we can get into some specific evidence for that in the debate itself, but I wanted to just bring attention to the general method of how we know scientific theories work, and we'll discuss that.
All right, Taylor, thank you for that 12-minute opening statement. To the audience, I've got all of your questions saved. Fantastic questions already, and so I appreciate it. TRock, we're now going to hand it to you for your 12-minute opening statement. Whenever you're ready, just let me know, and I'll start your timer.
Okay, give me just a second. I gotta let's see if I'm sharing my screen here. That's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
You're good.
Okay. Let me start at the beginning here. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. If evolutionists used good arguments, they would be creationists. Evolution is the modern mythology. Okay. Evolution. It is premised on the idea that it has certain evidences that support it. The main platforms here are homologies across the entire biosphere, nested hierarchies, same scope, genetics, ERVs, and converging lines of data. And we heard something along these lines of almost all of these during Taylor's intros. So it's well understood that that is what their platform is built on. But we're going to take a look and investigate why these actually are not good evidences. But so I want to take a minute and talk about. Sorry, hold on 1 second, please.
As we wait for TRock there, I do have the, I've got your timer paused. No worries.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Just let me know when you're ready.
Okay. I wanted, before I get into the meat of this, I want to talk real quick about the definition of two very important words in the title of the debate, good and evidence. Taylor touched on it a little bit, but when we talk about something being good evidence, what we should be saying is that it is logically consistent. That it's based on sound reasoning, and that the underlying principles are testable. And so we heard some of that, but it was mostly rhetoric. Good evidence must be logically consistent. What we will find is that the evidences that are put forth are not logically consistent in their interpretation. The other word here, evidence, major fallacy that so many of the critics make is basically exactly what Taylor did. He said that we have zero evidence. I always have to remind people we do not have zero evidence. We've got the same evidence that evolutionists have. You don't have different evidence than us. It's the same. If you have nested hierarchies, we have nested hierarchies. If you have genetics, we have genetics. If you have ERVs, we have ERVs. You can't reasonably say you have zero evidence. If anything, creationists have more evidence because we also accept the historical report of the Bible, which the evolutionist rejects. So we take all of the evidence that the evolutionist uses and add a historic report to it. So when you're parsing out, whether something is logically consistent with the worldview or not, and investigating the past in particular, you can look at the evidence, you can draw conclusions, you can make inferences, you can use inductive reasoning and all that kind of stuff. But there's a shortcut. There's a couple shortcuts. There's one decent shortcut and then one really good shortcut. The decent shortcut is to make a model. Taylor alluded to that, but unfortunately the model for evolution is always hypothetical. It's always lives in the virtual world. It can never actually be demonstrated in the real world. So making a model is a shortcut to provide some of the answers, but it's not the best shortcut. The best shortcut is to have an eyewitness to tell you the major details that happened. So I want to give a good example here of how that should work in real life. Let's say there was a car went by the highway. One witness says it was a red car. Another witness says, no, it wasn't a red car, it was a truck. Another witness says it was going west. Another one says it was going east. They've all got these conflicting reports. Where does good science come in? Good science comes in and says, okay, apparently a vehicle did go by. We don't know which direction based strictly on the eyewitness reports, but the eyewitnesses all 100% agree that a vehicle went by. So we can take what the foundational piece that's common across all of the testimony and use it as a premise to do an investigation. So if what Taylor said were true, that you can't rely on eyewitnesses, we wouldn't use them at all, ever. He pretty much said it's the worst form of evidence that there is. And I'm going to say the exact opposite. It's the best form. Because the eyewitness can't tell you how fast the car went. The eyewitness can't tell you, was the driver inebriated? Were there other passengers in the car? What kind of, couldn't tell you what kind of mechanical condition the car is in. But they can tell you that a car went by. And so in good science, you accept that piece of the testimony, and then you go look for things like, skid marks on the road or evidence that it went this direction versus that direction. But the bottom line is you did accept the eyewitness report. Otherwise, you wouldn't bother doing the investigation at all. You just say, oh, they're completely unreliable. We're not going to even waste our time with it. So on that premise, evolution is completely backwards, and that's another recurring theme with evolution. It always starts from the wrong end of the problem. It starts with the present, tries to drive it back to figure out what the past is, whereas in creation, it starts with the beginning. It's the only book that starts at the beginning and drives it forward. That's the only way you can legitimately know something, is to start at the beginning. So with that, I want to reiterate, you do not have different evidence than us. You've got the same evidence. And we are going to look at how to logically deduce which paradigm that fits better. So with that, homologies. The idea with homologies is similarity between structures of different organisms. The question is, can this be explained another way? These similarities can be the result of a design. Is there a logical reason for this other than common ancestry, or is common ancestry the only possible solution? It's quite obviously not the only possible solution. Even in a complete hypothetical world, it can't be the only possible solution. Therefore, homologies in and of itself does not distinguish evolution above and beyond creation at all. In reality, homologies has a really good explanation, and that has to do with design necessity that stems from the food source and locomotion requirements among the different life forms in different terrestrial and aqueous environments. Okay, homologies also says transitions across life forms from simple to complex through geological time. How would one actually determine transitions are happening using only fossils that appear sporadically in the strata? This is unfalsifiable ideology. A more complete analysis using internal organs, which we don't have for hardly any of the fossils, metabolism, genetics, we don't have ancient DNA, it's not possible, but would likely reveal a very different trend than simply looking at similarities between skeletal structures. Where is deep time apparent in the strata? All geological strata, pre-Ice Age, are horizontally deposited waterborne sediments or igneous in nature that are only deposited quickly. Unconformities are the norm. So when you're looking at sedimentary layers, the fossil-bearing sedimentary layers, there's no way to date those directly. So there is no apparent deep time to any of the fossil-bearing record. So what do you have left? You have igneous rocks that can be radiometric dating. Problem is, of course, that when you apply radiometric dating to rocks of known age, it's always a failure. It always has a non-zero starting point for a timeline. And that is problematic, because if a rock of known age can never start out with a true zero age by that very method, how do you know whether any rock that you find in any position in the geologic column ever had a zero starting time? The reality is that's the most unlikely scenario possible. What is stasis? Why is stasis so prevalent in the fossils? It's another really good example of how deep time is not apparent in the fossil record. Environmental pressures can't be the explanation for speciation, divergence, and simultaneous stasis by means of finding their niche. By definition, everything else is evolving around them, so what's the word I'm looking for? Their environmental pressures are constantly changing. Their competition for food is constantly changing, and yet they're staying the same for literally tens to hundreds of millions of years. Where are all the paleosols? There are virtually none to be found in the strata. The absence of topsoil combined with the extremely fast exponential reproduction rate of plants signals zero passage of time and zero periods of calm normal life where slow and gradual changes are supposed to have happened. Tony, how am I doing on time? I think I'm getting pretty close.
You're doing good. You've got about 3 minutes.
Okay. Nested hierarchies, an overall pattern that demonstrates chronological transition across the entire spectrum of life. Nesting and grouping, here's the problem. Why using this as a platform as an argument is not a valid premise and does not distinguish evolution above and beyond creation, because nested and grouping are conventions. They're just a way to think about things. You can line fossils up according to the environment that they live in, their locomotion, whether they fly or not, what type of eyes they have, what type of diet they have. It's purely convention. Nested groupings are conventions. They are not objective properties of the universe, is how I like to say it. They're subjective. You decide how you want to arrange them. And evolutionists have changed the nested hierarchies over time numerous times because they didn't like how they were arranged by previous generations of scientists. Other conventions are also useful, such as functional grouping, climate grouping, dietary grouping, etc. They can be very, very useful. If you're doing biomimetics, for example, you want all the flyers in a group. You don't care if they have some sort of supposed direct ancestral hierarchy to them or not. For example, you might investigate dragonflies and bats and butterflies and even flying fish. They have no direct relationship to each other. They're separated literally by hundreds of millions of years on the evolutionary timescale, but the functional grouping is highly relevant to good science. D-time is a necessary component of nested hierarchies, but it's completely absent from the geological strata. Branching patterns maintain the same overall consistency of transitions. That's the claim behind nested hierarchies. But branching patterns are just a scaled-down version of the overall nested hierarchy argument, so it's still just a convention. They are equally subjective and don't distinguish evolution above creation. I'm going to go ahead and stop here because I got quite a bit more to cover. So I'm going to go ahead and yield my time, and we'll move to the next stage.
No, that's good timing. You're basically at 12 minutes. So Taylor and TRock, that concludes the 12-minute opening statements. Thank you to the both of you for those openings. Okay, we're moving into the 8-minute uninterrupted rebuttal portion of the debate. Taylor, whenever you're ready, just let me know. I'll start your timer, and you've got 8 minutes.
Okay. So where are my notes here? So you mentioned that we have the same evidence, which is nominally true, except for the fact that none of this evidence is predictable by creationism. In fact, most of it was predicted before it was discovered and discovered as a result of being predicted by evolution exclusively. No other method has ever done this. So no, the evidence is not for creationism. You don't have the same evidence. I mean, we have access to the same evidence, but creationism does not have the evidence. The evidence is exclusively pointing towards evolution. So you can accommodate some of the evidence, like say, oh, well, God just made them similarly. So, okay, that you can make that fit, but evolution exclusively is able to predict what changes actually occur in the fossil record, what kind of forms we'll find in the fossil record. Creationism cannot do this. Evolution can do this. So that's evidence for evolution. That's good evidence. That's scientific evidence. That's how science works in all contexts. And that's much, much, much better evidence than eyewitness testimony. I don't know why you say it's the most trustworthy. It's actually the least trustworthy. I cited statistics that they're the biggest contributor to wrongful convictions in the criminal justice system. So no, it's eyewitness testimony is not necessarily, well, it's not the best shortcut. And it's not necessarily reliable. Obviously, it is some form of evidence, so you would want to provide that. And the more witnesses you have, the more confidence we have. And perhaps having multiple different eyewitnesses contradicting each other can also reveal some information. But as for the Bible, you can't confirm that any of that was eyewitness. So that's why I counted as 0 evidence, because we don't have an eyewitness swearing that they were there to see it. We have a broken chain of custody that just, we have no idea where these claims come from, especially originally. So what's more trustworthy, the witness who says there was a red car going east, or the security camera that will show without any errors that the light that was recorded that day, showing that it was a red truck, not a car, but going west and not east? Obviously, the security, if you have 100 witnesses testify that it was a red car going east, but you have the actual footage that shows it's a red truck going west, all of that witness testimony is invalidated. So you want better evidence than testimony. So, and I didn't say we can't rely on eyewitness testimony. I just said that it was the least reliable. You still want it. I don't think you have any. So the claim that it's the best evidence is just kind of a little bit wonky, you could say. It's because it has more chance for error and more chance for deception. You can't really fake security footage as easily, at least, as you can just lie or be mistaken. You can forget or mistake a lot easier than a video file or tire marks or physical evidence can. And again, if the piece of evidence leads you to more evidence, then that's basically predicting. So if you find a tire track at the murder scene and you connect that to someone's car, and so you search their house and you find a bloody knife in their house, okay, so now evidence is predicting other evidence. That's how evolution works. And exclusively evolution works for life history and biological life. There are no other competitors in this, so that's great evidence. So I'm glad you also mentioned radiometric dating. There are methods like isochron dating that don't rely on initial conditions. And if the part I'm most glad about is, if our radiometric dating methods are wrong, then we have the heat problem, and creationism is also impossible. So that's not a very good point in to debunk evolution with, because also life at all would be impossible. We wouldn't be here. So the fact that we're even here is confirmation of radiometric dating, because otherwise, if our calculations are off, it would have been going way too fast, creating way too much heat. And there's also not a single reason to believe that there was accelerated nuclear decay or that there were any fluctuations in decay rates at all. There's not one reason. Again, it's just accommodating ad hoc reasoning into creationism to make the evidence fit. The evidence doesn't actually predict creationism. So the other claim, there is no stasis in fossils, that's not true at all. You can see variations of every kind of fossil. There are, the more fossils we find, the more the gaps are filled in. There's every theme you can find on fossils, you'll find hundreds of variations on that, and they bleed into each other. Their baraminology is a creationist method. They have actually pretty much abandoned one of the methods, which is to find gaps in morphological clusters. So there was an interesting paper on that. This is a visual from that paper. This is the name of the paper. And basically, the more bird and dinosaur fossils they found, actually the different clusters started growing into a single cluster, which by the creation standards meant that birds and dinosaurs were related. So we actually don't have any stasis. And so we also had comments about how environmental pressures have to be the same for all species. They don't. Some species may be more resistant to overall environment changes. They can handle more environments than others, so they might stay the same while others change. environmental pressures don't have to affect all species equally. I don't understand why that was asserted at all. Let's see. I didn't see any logical inconsistencies about evolution other than just pointing out, again, questioning the reliability of certain methods, which we have no reason to actually question other than, well, we haven't had a video camera on a sample of uranium
30
for 4
seconds.
billion years straight. We don't need to do that. You can take a 2-second measure of someone's speed with a police radar, and you don't have to follow them for an hour to know how many miles an hour they're going. And the final point, I guess, homologies, common parts, means that they're similar enough to be related. So that's also a self-destroying point of creationism. All the data points exclusively to evolution.
Thank you very much, Snake, for that 8-minute rebuttal. We're now going to restart the timer and hand it over to TRock. TRock, whenever you're ready, you have an 8-minute rebuttal. If you need to share screen, feel free to let me know and I'll put that up for you.
Okay, so I don't need to share my screen at the moment, but I want to kind of highlight a couple of points. I know probably a lot of the audience would really like to investigate some of the actual evidences that are out there so that we can kind of put some of this stuff to the test, and we're going to do that. But I want to cover a couple major logical fallacies that Taylor's already made. Number one is his whole assessment of eyewitness testimony. The problem is, of course, it's what somebody like Frank Turek would call a self-defeating argument. I think Taylor actually kind of alluded to that very concept there just a minute ago. But denying the effectiveness of eyewitness testimony is a self-defeating argument because the scientist himself has to play the role of the observer. When the scientist goes to the field, collects samples, compiles data, he is the observer. Now he's reporting what he saw, what he did, how he did it. He is pretty much, in some cases, the sole observer. Occasionally, of course, occasionally it's probably fairly common that these guys will work in teams, and so there often is more than one observer, but there are still observers. So to throw out the premise of the effectiveness of an observer based on what was actually presented as a very misleading statistic. 52% of all wrongful convictions are from incorrect eyewitness testimony. What Taylor's not telling you, and this is a perfect example of why evolution is not a good methodological approach to history. What he's not telling you is that of all of the criminal trials in the world that do happen, the vast majority of them render a correct, accurate decision, even with eyewitness testimony. It's only that subset of wrongful convictions that 52% applies to. And if that total number of wrong convictions only represents, say, 1% of all criminal trials, then what's 52% of 1%? You're literally down to barely over 0.5% of all criminal trials go wrong because of eyewitness testimony. You pretty much just admitted that 99.5% of all eyewitness testimony is valid. So this is exactly why we reject evolution, because they always bring the cherry-picked data, and we're going to get into some of that here in just a little bit. One of the examples I want to cover has to do with chromosome 2, which I'm not an expert in, but I do have some really good information on that to share here in just a minute. But I'm going to go through some of Taylor's arguments that he made, not the least of which had to do with predictions. Again, another very, very misleading idea, basically a false claim that he made, that only evolution can make these predictions. This is completely untrue. This was brought out of one of my previous debates where somebody pointed out that they're not technically predictions. And I pointed out that that is true. They're not technically predictions. What they are is they're following a sequence of patterns and filling in the missing piece in the pattern. Case in point, of course, is something like tiktaalik. So the evolutionists claim only evolution can predict the existence of a fossil like Tiktaalik. This is completely untrue for two reasons. Primarily because Tiktaalik was going to represent this intermediate form between land and aquatic environments. But the problem is, of course, is that in real time today, we can look and see that there are intermediate, so to speak, forms of locomotion, modes of locomotion between land and aquatic forms. So, for example, salamanders, turtles, ducks, all those types of animals. You have webbed feet. You have flippers like the mud skipper. There's a catfish that's able to use its flippers to kind of make its way across muddy environments to get to another source of water, so it doesn't dehydrate. If it doesn't find it, it will die. But anyway, the point is that in real time you can see this pattern, and so the creationist is equally capable of looking at the real pattern in today's world and comparing it to the fossil record and saying, okay, what the environment I'm looking at in the fossil record looks like a semi-aquatic environment. Therefore, I should find forms that are roughly equivalent to modern forms. And furthermore, for evolution to actually distinguish itself in this regard, it has to utilize the principles that are unique to evolution, that are exclusive to creation. And there are two principles. One of them is deep time, and the other one is the lack of intentional, intelligent guidance. But neither one of those are necessary to find an intermediate form between a land form and an aquatic form. You don't need a backdrop of any sense for deep time to be true or not in order to make the connection in a simple patternistic line like that. So what else did he say? Randomness can do a lot more than intelligence. Yeah, put that to real practice. You can do that in the virtual world maybe, but you're neglecting to tell people that you have to write some sort of sense and provide the material, front load the material up front in a virtual world to do that. You would never tie your shoe by randomness. You would never design a toothpick by randomness. There is nothing in our actual human intelligent world that we would use that principle for to create anything meaningful. And when intelligence does invoke any sense of randomness, it's intentionally, intelligently choosing that method. So that's so far out of line that I don't know how anybody can make such a claim with a straight face that randomness can do a lot more than intelligence. Randomness can't write a 2-letter word on the sidewalk. Randomness can't do anything that intelligence can do. High complexity is indicative of evolution. No, this is exactly what Taylor did. He said that creationists do is that they make the evidence fit the data. High complexity is indicative. That is exactly that. That is forcing the evidence to fit the data. High complexity is a human characteristic that distinguishes us above the animal kingdom. We are able to go to lengths of complexity and specified complexity that the animal kingdom cannot achieve. And no evolutionist would say that, an ape, a bird, whatever, a squid, as it were, has zero intelligence, but they cannot do the specified complexity that humans can do. So high complexity is not indicative of evolution. It is a human intelligent characteristic. Okay. With that, what I would really like to do as an intro, my last 30 seconds, is talk about chromosome 2 for just a minute. What we're going to see, and I don't have time to go real deep into this, but as an intro, what we're going to see is that the evolutionist has a very limited view of how chromosome 2 supposed fusion site actually matches the data. And we'll hopefully get to look at that here in just a second.
Okay, TRock, thank you very much for that 8-minute rebuttal. Gentlemen, that concludes the opening statements and the rebuttals. Lots of great points on the table for us to discuss and engage during the next 50 minutes of discussion. So TRock, you did just end with your rebuttal. And so let's give the floor to Taylor. Feel free to pick the first topic or the first point for us to engage in the discussion period. So, gentlemen, the floor is yours. Go ahead. Oh, Taylor, you're just on mute. Let me unmute you.
Yeah.
Okay, you're good to go.
So you accused me of several logical fallacies and then didn't give a single example. I don't know where the logical fallacies are. You went on to say that I said that I denied the effectiveness of eyewitness testimony. I explicitly said that I'm not saying that it's not evidence. I'm saying that it's the worst evidence. So just to kind of respond to that part, and then we can talk about this testimony thing. You said that all science is just eyewitness testimony, or at least that's what it seemed like you were saying. But no, any reports in a scientific paper are backed up by records like videos, pictures, or printouts from the computer results or from the machines that do the work for them.
Who makes the record?
And they are repeatable. So that's actually not testimony based. The testimony itself is being bolstered by physical evidence.
I think you missed the very important point that some human had to make the record. That makes that person who made the record an eyewitness to the creation of the record. It also makes them an eyewitness to the validity of the data in the record. Somebody has to review the record, the data set, whatever it is, and decide whether it's valid data, whether it needs to be cleaned up, whether we can accept it as it is. A human observer has to make that decision.
Who cares? So the person, it doesn't matter if a person does it or a computer takes the picture. The picture is physical data. That's not testimony. So the pictures are both. So if a scientist says, I saw this happen, and then he gives you pictures, are you going to call the pictures eyewitness testimony, or are the pictures actually making his testimony more reliable?
A picture is obviously a form of eyewitness. It's a machine that does the exact same thing the human eye does. And then guess what?
That's not how the word is used.
Human observers have to look at the picture and determine if it's a valid picture or not. So
that's not testimony either. Do you know what testimony means?
Yes.
So looking at a picture is testimony?
Again, who decides whether the picture is legitimate or not? See, here's one of the things that you've kind of conflated in this line of arguing is that when we're talking about a historical report, science cannot repeat the past. There's nothing you can do to repeat a past event. You can approximate some past events, like walking across the street or cutting a tree down, but you can't repeat something like the Big Bang. You can't repeat the process of going from microbial agents to human population. You can't repeat any of that. So when you say something's repeatable, it really sounds like you're conflating exactly what the scientific investigation is doing.
Conflating what?
You're conflating what's repeatable and what's not. So if you take an example, if you take a working example like radiometric dating, it's repeatable that you can count the uranium atoms and you can count the lead atoms. You can repeat that all you want. You cannot repeat how they got into the rocks.
Yes, you can. We can repeat. We can go back in time and observe that rock getting it into it, but we can observe the same type of processes and chemical processes, which we know are the same things because the same chemicals always act the same, and we've never witnessed it.
I just said that you can approximate some things, but that's not the same as actually repeating the original event.
So, okay, so that's the same thing as saying, well, there's a bullet embedded in the wall. We don't know that bullet was fired from a gun because we'll never be able to know that.
No,
because we didn't witness that one.
Example.
Yeah, so repeating things is not the only way to know something, right? It's just one of the ways to test it.
Uranium atoms don't.
What?
Bullets have a known origin. Uranium atoms don't. From a scientific perspective, no scientist in the world knows how a uranium atom got on terra firma.
Yeah, there are lots of theories about that.
A lot of theories.
But it doesn't matter. We know how that cycles.
Which one of the theories is correct?
I don't think that's relevant.
Yeah,
Where
it's totally relevant because you have to
atom
establish that you know where
nucleosynthesis.
uranium atoms come from to say that shooting finding an embedded bullet in a wall is the same as doing a radiometric dating test when you have no idea where the lead or the uranium came from.
Yeah, it doesn't matter at all, not even a little bit, because
That's
we
why
don't need to
evolution is
know
a
what
science.
factory. We don't need to know what factory the bullet came from. We don't need to know where the metal it came from. We don't know how the atoms in the metal were made to know that bullets get fired out of guns. We don't need to know how uranium fell onto the earth or was poofed magically into existence on the earth to know what it does when it's in the earth.
Actually, I
So
kind of pointed
this is
this out
just
earlier.
distracting from the point.
I know I kind of pointed this out earlier about radiometric dating in general, is that there is no such thing as a modern igneous formation that has a zero starting point. If no modern igneous formation has a zero starting point, why would you assume that all of the ones that you don't know when they happen do have a zero starting point?
What does that mean?
Exactly. That's not science. You're basically
That's not a
jumping
scientific
from you're
term.
jumping from you can go radiometric date Mount St. Helens and get a non-zero age. But that's probably true for every igneous formation in the world.
So
they all
are
start
you
out that way.
asking? Are you asking me how that there are no formations that have that perfect ideal chemical starting point, or are you asking me why you can't radiometrically date anything?
No, I'm asking you what rationale
Because you're
would
hopping all over the
inform you.
place.
What rationale would inform you that radiometric dating is valid because it has a zero starting point?
What is the zero starting point?
That means T equals 0 when the rock formed. That means that, for example, in the
Of
uranium
course
lead
it has T
example,
equals 0.
that means it's 100% uranium and 0% lead. That's T equals 0.
T equals 0 is true whether a god poofed it into existence or not.
You're telling me exactly what I'm telling the audience. You don't know how to determine whether a radiometric sample ever had a zero starting point.
Yeah, we do, because we witness it form today. So we know what it looks like when it forms.
But you know it has a non-zero starting point. Every time.
A non-zero or a 0?
A non-zero starting point. There are
'cause you
active
keep
volcanoes all
flipping
over
back
the
and
world
forth between
today. Go
0
grab
and
you a
non-zero.
sample and take a radiometric, do a radiometric dating test of whichever method you choose,
Yeah,
and it's
so
going to give you a non-zero age.
this is why I'm confused, because you keep conflating the ability to observe what the conditions are when rocks set to what the number is that pumps out when you do a certain inaccurate test on a piece of rock that's new.
I'm not
You're
conflating
you're
it. I'm
flipping
telling
back
you,
and forth rapidly between these 2 points.
I'm not conflating anything. I'm telling you very plainly that
No, you're not.
if radiometric dating were valid, you could tell me what the mechanism, or some scientists could tell me what's the mechanism that causes it to start out, for example, 100% uranium and 0% lead. What's the mechanism that makes that happen in the earth?
Well, for example, lead will bind to zircons in lava formations. So that's one mechanism.
Except that in modern igneous formations, you also have lead in the zircons.
Right, in the zircons.
Yeah.
Which absorb the lead from the surrounding lava. It separates the lead from the uranium.
So you just
and there are
said
different
that
isotopes
it absorbs
of lead.
both.
So we can tell what the ratio of isotopes.
Yeah, you can count the ratio. That's not in dispute.
Mm-hmm.
It's how did any rock ever start out with 0 lead and 100%, or 0 daughter, as it were, and 100% parent? How did that ever happen? You have 0 working examples of it happening.
No, there are tons of examples of that happening. That's the whole
Really?
point. And
Really?
if that's wrong, we have a heat problem.
No, we don't.
Yeah.
That's a different discussion, and I'm happy to have that. But we're
It's
talking
really
about
not.
the validity
That
of
confirms it.
We're talking
The
about the
fact that
validity of evidence for evolution.
Right. So if you're questioning the validity of measuring the speed of something, which is observable, and applying it in the rocks. So if our measurements are off about that, that means that it's going to produce a lot more heat.
No.
So the fact
No,
that we're
it's-
here means that the measurements, that we're not a molten pile of rock, means that the measurements are accurate.
No, you exactly missed why that's not true. Because they start out with non-zero to begin with, and there's no heat problem when they start out with non-zero.
You don't
Today.
start with non-zero. You start at T
Show me
equals
one.
0.
Show me a modern observable example where you can radiometric date a real Earth igneous rock and its T equals 0. Show me one.
So again, you're conflating it.
No.
Yes, you are. You don't understand this at all. You're
Trust me.
conflating the radiometric measurement with the composition of the rock itself.
No, I'm not. The
You
composition
don't even
has to
understand
be
the words coming out of your mouth.
the composition has to be 0 daughter at the onset to apply the rate the way it's used and get a real age.
And then you're asking me,
parent or daughter element, again, daughter element has to start out at 0. So the ratio of daughter to parent has to be 0.
It doesn't
to start in order for the method to work.
No, you can have a little bit.
What, super tiny,
it produces
tiny
more. It's about
to a million.
Again, it doesn't even matter actually. We've gone down a rabbit hole. All you have to do is measure the ratio between the parent and daughter. You don't have to know the initial conditions.
That is completely untrue.
Nope. There are entire methods based on this. This has been done to death. I don't know why you guys can't catch up to this, but we're way off of whether eyewitness testimony is reliable or not.
Well,
I think that's
specific
intentional.
topic is there good evidence for evolution? And I'm starting with radiometric dating and pointing out very plainly that if you don't have a 0 starting point for the daughter element, then radiometric dating is not a valid evolutionary evidence.
Well, we can cross-confirm it. Mount Vesuvius was dated accurately to the reports.
Mount Vesuvius?
Or Pompeii, was it? Or
using what method?
Pompeii or Vesuvius? Radiometric dating.
Which method? I'll give you a hint. It was not lead uranium or uranium. It wasn't rubidium and strontium.
I don't care. We can cross-confirm them. Different methods of dating the same samples from the same layer put out the same number. Again, there's no reason to assume any of this is false because all the evidence, all the tests.
There is only one.
Actually, gentlemen, let me jump in real quick. And I know this is free flowing and you're both doing a fantastic job. Very great conversation. We did just hit the 13-minute mark, and basically we've discussed radiometric dating. Feel free to take the next couple minutes to kind of wrap up your thoughts and points on this specific topic, and maybe we should move on to another line of evidence to discuss. Okay, go ahead. Continue the conversation.
I would like to point out real quick that there is only one radiometric method that could possibly validate Mount Vesuvius, and that is carbon-14. It's the only one that's designed to function in that timeline. The rest of them are much more on the order of hundreds of thousands to millions to tens of millions or billions of years. So Mount Vesuvius you cannot use potassium argon on Mount Vesuvius. You cannot use uranium lead. There is only one method. It's carbon-14. And carbon-14, that is an example where you literally use the archaeological context to validate the carbon-14 method, not the other way around. So with that, I'm done with radiometric dating 2. I really want to talk about chromosome 2 fusion for a minute. And I guess I'll ask you, Taylor, so you can talk for a little bit.
We're not done with testimony.
This is about good evidence for evolution.
You shirk that off.
No, this is about good evidence for evolution.
Right. So we still haven't even established what a standard for good evidence is. So is eyewitness testimony better when it has hard physical evidence backing it up, or worse, or the same?
It's always better to have both. That's not disputed.
That's not what I asked.
So say your question one more time.
Is the eyewitness testimony better with hard physical evidence to back it up.
It can be, yeah. But hard physical evidence can be misinterpreted. Because guess what? It takes a human observer to interpret it.
Is it always better to have that? Or is there any time where it's worse to have a video camera of the testimony?
A video camera is an extension of eyewitness. I'm not sure why you want to go to that.
No, it's not. There's no
to bypass eyewitness testimony. It's a
camera is not an eyewitness, and it's not giving testimony. You can metaphorically call a camera an eye, and
it gives you an indirect method as a human to observe the event, though.
It's pretty direct.
That is a completely different type of evidence than radiometric dating or fossil interpretations. It's completely
physical evidence.
If you had a video of those fossils forming, we wouldn't be having this discussion.
We do.
We do?
Yep.
Where is it?
Got a lot of holes in it, but we have a video because video is still images put in a sequence. So we have still images of the rocks put in sequence. And so you can still tell what happens in a movie, even if you're missing a lot of the frames. That's what we have with the fossil record.
That's not a video. That's a really poor analogy to a video.
It's not even an analogy. It's just literally true.
That's and the fossil
video
record in the grand scheme of a billion-year timeline. The fossil record represents like 1 out of 10 million frames. So you saw 1 out of every 10 million frames, and you're calling that a video?
And we can predict what frames are, where they are. And there's only one method to do that.
No, yeah, it's a patternistic method. It's based on the physical appearances. It has nothing to do with how much time passed to get it there.
So is your problem the time scale or the fact that they're related?
Both. You can't establish relatedness in the way that evolution does. It's the same extrapolation error that you've been making all night. You're jumping from a very short step to a very big step without demonstrating the 9,999,999 frames in between. And that's why the fossil record is very poor evidence for evolution.
Except that it's only predictable by evolution, thus it's the best possible evidence that we have for the fossil record. I don't remember. Did you say yes to the fact that hard physical evidence makes testimony more reliable or not?
In and of itself, it can't make testimony more reliable. It can support a case better. Yes, that's not
the same
disputed.
thing.
No,
supporting it better and more reliable, same thing.
Can people misinterpret physical evidence?
Yes, but less so than testimony.
That's entirely not true. The evolutionary
paradigm
is a story of changing the story. The whole story of evolution is about changing its story. So that means that they have done nothing but misinterpret the evidence for decades, centuries actually, and just come up with a different story. That means they've been misinterpreting it all along.
No, they haven't changed the story.
Yeah,
you might say, oh, this armadillo is a little bit more related to this armadillo, but no, the general story is not changed. And it's really ironic that religions say that, because that's precisely what makes their conclusions so unreliable, because they cannot change with the new data. And in fact, it is forbidden to change it with any new data. And so it's really funny also because religions change all the time, from the fact that Jewish religions used to be pagan religions, and the Christian religion came from the Jewish religions. And the early Christian practices were all very different, especially different from the modern Christian practices. And the Christianity evolved from several different cults, combining and changing and diverging into the canon from the Roman Empire, and has since split into other sects, which actually mirrors evolution, but that's beside the point. So when you say things change, religions change due to people just making things up because they aren't testable. Sciences change because they're only getting sharper and better, but that's because they are testable.
So in keeping with the title of the debate, is there good evidence for evolution? Picking apart a broad array of religions is not providing good evidence for evolution. But something you said that is another really good example of your self-defeating argument is that in young earth creation in particular, the story does not change because the Bible is the foundation, and you said it can't update with new evidence. Newsflash, what happened yesterday, it can't be different tomorrow because you've got a different idea of what happened yesterday. What happened. It's true because it's true. You can't produce some new evidence that makes what happened yesterday some different event than what actually happened. So the story doesn't need to change if you already know what it is. And that's the difference between evolution and
the question is whether your story represents what actually happened, and
yeah,
there's
so
absolutely no evidence for that.
Again, I want to talk about chromosome 2 fusion for a minute, because I would like to hear you kind of describe to us how it is that you know chromosome 2 fusion represents a real historic event.
Because we witness chromosomal fusions. We know what those look like.
Did you witness the one that allegedly happened 6 million years ago?
Again, so we have to go back to basic understanding of what evidence is. You say, did you witness the bullet come out of that specific bullet at the crime scene come out of a gun? Well, if you didn't, then we have no idea whether it came out of a gun or not. No, we know bullets come out of guns. That's how they get out of guns.
I guess let me try and get real specific for a minute. Can you tell me what methodology?
You need to address that. You really need to address this double standard.
No, I am exactly addressing it. I would like for you to tell me what methodology would help you determine that this chromosome, this alleged fusion site, is truly indicative of a fusion event. What's the method behind that?
The structure of it, having hallmarks of chromosomal fusions that we witness happening.
Can you be more specific?
No,
I mean, I understand that it should have
basic concepts.
We all understand that it should bear some physical resemblances between a real fusion event, but can you be more specific and tell us in this example, since it is a very well-studied example, can you tell us specifically what characteristics of the alleged fusion site tell you that a real fusion event happened 6 million years ago?
The fused centromere.
That's it?
That's one of them.
Any more?
That's nowhere else in the chromosomes. Why would God just put one randomly in the middle? It's not necessary.
Is there any more than that?
The only thing we've observed that coming from is from chromosomal fusions.
Taylor, I'm trying to give you a chance.
So the evidence, again, is exclusively for evolution.
I am trying to give you a chance to demonstrate solidly how scientific method applies to this particular evidence. And all you're saying is telomere. So if you would allow me, give me just a couple minutes.
You didn't listen to anything I said, did you?
Yes, I did. And I'm trying to give you an opportunity to provide for us.
So if we know the origins,
a real methodological approach to making that decision.
We have observed that the only observed origins that are known to mankind for these structures are chromosomal fusions.
Taylor, let's say the obvious.
So
if a scientist made your argument,
that we
he
didn't
would never publish anything in the open literature.
I was mid-sentence. So we observe one that exists. We didn't observe its creation, but we've observed the creation of others. We have no other observed origins of this. So where does the evidence point? Points towards it's most likely this thing that we've observed creating this type of structure before.
Okay, I'll say it one more time. If a scientist used your line of argumentation, he'd never publish in the open literature. There's got to be a real method of comparison. Do you not have any idea how to go about doing that?
I just gave you that, and no, that's a lie. That is
Okay.
precisely how we do things in the medical industry. Oh, this person has these symptoms of COVID. I wonder what it is. Is it a metabolic bone disease? Is it cancer? Or let's see, people presenting with COVID have specifically these symptoms. Therefore, it's probably COVID. That is
Okay.
how science works.
Let me show you how
You
science.
can't play games with this.
Let me show you how science actually works, Taylor, because I actually pulled some data for chromosome 2 fusion, and
Let me
openly.
let me show all of the scientists how science actually works.
Taylor, I'm
Is
about to
what you just
demonstrate
said.
to you that one of us actually has a method, and the other one is just kind of hand waving. So the TTA, GGG, CCC, TAA, I ran some checks on the comparisons. The alleged fusion site, here's the deal. The alleged fusion site has about 10 instances of TTA, GGG, and I think around 38 or 40 instances of CCC-TAA. Now, what I have on this tab right here, I can't show it very well because I had to make it so small you can't see it. But what I have here is the first 60 million letters of human chromosome 2, okay? Which is, I'm not claiming it's the end that was supposed to be fused. What I'm saying is I'm going to compare the fusion site to what the end of a telomere actually looks like, the end of a chromosome actually looks like. And what I found was the this sequence right here, what it kind of shows you, this is the inside. So there are 798 base pairs in the alleged fusion site. But an actual telomere sequence has, I believe, on the order of tens of thousands, if not at least several thousand, not just 798. But the density, what I was describing a little while ago, TTA, GGG, the ratio of that to CCC, TAA is about 1 to 4, okay, in the alleged fusion site. Well, in the actual end of chromosome 2, it has a ratio, and I have it written down here somewhere, but it has a different ratio. It's not quite the same, but here was the thing that really stuck out to me whenever I did this. CCC TAA. So you see all these right here? I've highlighted every time that they popped up, and the frame spacing, the column location. This was kind of one of the important parts. But within the first several, within the first 2,000 or so sequences, I found that the TTA, no, it was the CCC TAA, had a letter swap, and the letter swap looked like a T to a G. And so the letter G appeared 10 times more frequently in the beginning of a chromosome than in the alleged fusion site, which tells me, and it looks like it's a letter swap mutation, like a point mutation. So what that tells me is that the alleged fusion site has been exposed to a completely different chemical environment, so to speak, than the end of the telomere. In other words, it was never the end of a telomere. Otherwise, it would have been exposed to the same thing and had the same type of point mutation distribution in it. But it doesn't. It's very different.
So your argument is that this region mutated, therefore it can't have come from the end of a telomere.
I'm saying that that's an indicator that it's probably came from a different environment than what the end of a chromosome is normally exposed to. Which means what that means to me is that chromosomes in 3D space occupy 3D space. They're not linear. They actually occupy 3D space, and they have folding sequences in them sometimes. So because of that,
protective ends of DNA is exposed to different chemicals. Yeah.
And so the other claim behind the fusion site is that it's highly degraded. But if it's highly degraded, why isn't it degraded in the same fashion that the beginning of the chromosome is degraded, where it literally has obvious signatures of single letter swaps throughout
Because it's not
the CCCTAA sequence.
because it's not functioning as a telomere anymore.
And
So
so
non-functional regions of the genome mutate faster over time, over the population scale.
you sound like you missed the point that the end of the chromosome is the telomere, the normal telomere region.
Mm-hmm.
But let me show you another pattern that I found. You see these 29 letters right here? I'm going to zoom this up. Well, I don't know how I'm going to make this where people can see it real well, but there are 29 letters in this sequence. This is in the end of human chromosome 2 at the beginning. It's at the beginning of it. 29 specific letters. You see this column right here? You know what that is? That same sequence appears literally 10 times back to back with no interruptions. So statistically, 2 letters in a row, to find any 2-letter combination in a row, it should be super common throughout a chromosome. To find 10 letters in a row should be much less common. To find 29 in a row should be super infrequent. Like, it should be really rare. And what I found in the telomeric region, the first several thousand of the so here, this tells you the exact position, 11,126. You got to keep in mind that the first 10,000 are non-described. They don't have an ACTG designation. But so these actually represent the first 865 and the last 1,126. 29 letters, 10 times back to back in a real chromosome end. The scientific investigation that would validate your idea of fusion would be to go find something very similar to this in a chimp chromosome 2A or 2B. And here's our problem with evolution. It does not provide good evidence. It provides very cherry-picked evidence, because if it was providing good evidence, it would find things like this and go look to validate it in the actual chimp chromosome. The claim for evolution is that we are 98% similar to chimp DNA. Another extremely cherry-picked piece of information. But if that's true, that means that this 290-letter sequence should only have about 2% degradation between this and the chimp version, and this should be there. But is any evolutionist actually looking for this in the chimp chromosomes? I don't think they are, because they've kind of ignored this for the sake of the simple TTA-GGG argument.
So that was, I let you go on kind of a long rant there, but I didn't hear any actual points. So, yeah, if we look at the human and chimp, or human and gorilla breakdown of DNA similarities, they're all the same except for the fact of this one fusion. And if we draw any separating lines, well, that means that tigers, jaguars, and lions, they're all not related either. So I don't know what your point is here. That there are structures in the telomeres of humans that aren't present in chimps. Is that what you're saying?
I am saying that a proper scientific investigation goes much deeper than the very superficial 798 base pairs with just a few examples of the CCCTAA and TTA-GGG sequences.
So literally,
because they
just
don't
out
even
of the
look
gap.
like the end. They don't even look like the end of an actual chromosome.
Right, because they're fused and mutated. So it's basically just out of the
how
gap.
would you?
So
how
we
would you
have these dozens and dozens of similarities. Actually, I mean, just for this part, there are actually tens of, millions of actual similarities. But you say, oh, hey, look, well, you don't know about this gap, therefore that's where my God can hide. So again, this is a fallacy, so we have to throw it out. The fallacies are meaningless. There's nothing
you keep moving the goalposts. The whole idea here is to investigate whether the method that is used by evolution to determine this fusion, is it a valid method? Not
why
accuse
isn't it
somebody
valid?
of throwing their own explanation at it. I'm not even giving an explanation. I'm just saying
You didn't
To
say
stop at
anything that
seven-
would invalidate the
to stop
comparison
at
of
the
the
simple
structures.
and to stop at the simple comparison of the telomeric, the identifiable telomeric sequences in 798 base pairs and say, poof, it's a fusion event. That's not a thorough investigation by any good scientific standard.
How?
I just
Because
explained that to
that's
you.
that because
The
you didn't
actual
explain anything. You just said there are some differences.
no,
So that
I
pokes
explained
holes
very
in it.
clearly that a telomere that a telomere site is several thousand sequences long, not 798, and
Okay. That
that
doesn't mean anything.
the telomeres are actually not degraded in the fusion site the way you're describing
Do
compared
you
to
think it's
what's
supposed to be?
actually in the
Do you
end
think it should
of
look fresh? Do you think it should look like this fused yesterday? Or should there
no.
maybe be millions of years of mutations in it?
That brings me
If
to
the
another
theory
really
held true.
that brings me to another really good point.
That was a
Let me
yes
ask
or
you
no.
this.
That was a yes or no question.
Ask the question again.
Are you expecting this to look like a fresh fusion that happened yesterday and has mutations in it, or has no
No,
mutations in it?
no, I never said
Okay,
anything
so
remotely
what's the
like that.
problem? Why is the fact that there are mutations in it a problem for the
I'm
comparison?
telling you, the CCCTAA, that is a proper telomeric sequence. That's not a degraded sequence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's in this alleged fusion site.
That's a point for me.
No, because what I'm telling you is compare it to an actual telomeric end that functions today in real time as a telomeric end of a chromosome, and the actual telomeric end looks more degraded than this. So it's not degraded the way you're saying it is.
You just said the fact that it looks like a telomeric end actually means that it doesn't look like a telomeric end. You literally said the actual telomeric sequence that's in this supposed fusion site. That's a quote. So
you
I'm gonna
literally
need you to
sound like
kind
you're
of
quote mining
pick a lane
what
here.
you literally sound like you're quote mining because what I'm saying, put it all
Sound like
together.
what? You're cutting out.
Quote mining. Put
That's
it all
just what you
together.
said.
Put it all together.
Put it together. That's where the contradiction comes out.
No, put it all together means
Pick
look at
one,
more than
and then don't
700.
have a
Look at more
contradictory
than
term.
798 base pairs and compare an actual human telomeric end of a chromosome to a chimp chromosome, 2A or 2B, and tell me if you really do see the similarities there. I'm suggesting that this 290 base pair sequence that I found in the end of a true human chromosome is not anywhere in 2A or 2B of the chimp. And it should be if it was a true fusion event.
No. There's no reason to think that it should be. That's your problem.
So let me ask you this, and you can take the floor for a minute and tell me, how do you determine the temporal distance between species? That's directly relevant to this argument.
Usually mutation rates.
Can you be more specific?
No.
You literally
Mutation
don't
rate.
know.
Or,
And it's okay. I'm not trying to beat you up
difference
if
in
you
the
don't
fossil
know.
record.
I'm just trying to, if you do know, tell me more specific. Do you know the method to determine temporal distances between species in the evolutionary paradigm?
Do you want me to do the math for you? I don't. How specific?
I'm just asking you, do you know the method?
Yeah.
Can you be, I'm not asking you to do the math. I'm asking you to describe the method a little more specifically than just saying mutation rates. We all know it's mutation rates.
I'm not going to explain anything new. We
Okay.
know how long things take to happen.
I'll explain
we can
it
measure
then.
the difference.
I'll explain it then. Is that okay with you?
This is kind of irrelevant. We still haven't decided.
You're trying to demonstrate to us
on
that
a
scientific method provides good evidence for evolution.
Which is what's important here. This is what you're confused by, and this is what I came here to debate. What is a good standard of evidence? And all these things, they conform to a standard of evidence of science, but then you find one little thing that's unknown or one little thing that seems odd to you, and you say, oh, it's 100% unreliable now. That's not real. That's not how science works.
That's not what I said, Taylor.
It is.
I said you need to do a deeper dive into the data than simply stopping with 798
So you're
base
saying
pairs.
it meets the criteria. I want more, or else I'm just going to reject it out of hand.
Okay, I want to describe for the audience real quick what the scientific approach is for determining temporal distance between species.
I already did. I'm not wasting any more time.
No, you didn't. You did not. You didn't. You barely scratched the surface. Science is about being specific.
Mm-hmm. And that's why you're not doing science, and all the scientists are, because they actually do the specifics. They're actually educated on it. They don't just nitpick and cherry pick. There is an actual standard for evidence, predictions, applicability, which evolution has, and creationism does not, which you haven't addressed. That's a death blow right there. But you want to ignore that and just talk about.
No, Taylor, I'm trying to show you how to put the scientific method to use.
And that's explainable by mutations.
I'm trying to show you how to put the scientific method to use. I don't mind letting you talk, but
I would like the scientific method.
For the sake of the audience, I would like to actually apply some of these ideas and show the evolutionary method versus reality. So I'd like to briefly.
There is no evolutionary method. It's the scientific method using evolution can make predictions that you can't make. So
can you give me
the game is over?
Just this like particular method.
How much time do we have left?
It'll take me about 2 minutes to describe this method.
You got about 20, 21 minutes. 20 to 21 minutes.
Give me about 2 minutes to describe this method, and then you can offer your rebuttal or your
so you just want an extra 2 minutes for just to lecture uninterrupted.
No, I'm demonstrating for the audience how to apply a scientific method. That's something you're not. You're making a bunch of claims, but you have yet to demonstrate how to use the scientific method. And I'm fixing to demonstrate how evolution does this and how it should be done.
How is it not using the scientific method if your hypothesis can predict actual data? How is that not the scientific method? This is the big picture stuff that you won't touch.
I need to cut to the chase and explain this real quick so people can see what the actual dilemma is.
But we're not even getting to the big picture stuff of what is a criterion of evidence.
Taylor.
So we can't. We have nothing to compare whatever you're going to bring up against.
You're throwing claims and definitions out there, but at some point we've got to try them out to see if they work.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to take just a second.
We don't have anything to try it out against.
Yes, I do. That's why I'm fixing to go ahead and just describe the actual evolutionary method of determining temporal distance between species. The method it does start with mutation rates, but they specifically for long distance, deep time, in other words, relationship, what they do is they take the 2% or so protein coding only segments of DNA and make a comparison. And there is some math behind it. I'm not going to go into all that, but the greater point is the temporal distances are determined strictly by the 2% protein coding regions. What's the problem with that? Ancestry does not come about with only 2% of your DNA. Ancestry comes about with 100% of your DNA. What's the other problem? Species. What's a species?
Explain how that's a problem.
That's what I'm fixing to do. Species. What makes a species a different species than any other species? The two things that make them typically different have to do with phenotypical changes and segregation of the population. In other words, they can't interbreed, or in some cases they don't. They could hypothetically, but they don't. So they're called two different species because they have phenotypical differences and they don't interbreed. That's what kind of defines the bedrock of what a species is. So as that relates to temporal distance, though, the 2% protein coding region has nothing whatsoever to do with speciation. It's the 98% regulatory portion of the DNA that changes the phenotype. It's what tells the 2% how to arrange itself. In other words, you get speciation from the 98%, not the 2% by itself. So how do you extrapolate into the deep past without the 98% regulatory information? It's like me dumping a pile of bricks and 2x4s in your lawn and expecting you to build a house without a plan.
This is why you might want to like educate yourself formally on these things, because yes, the regulatory information, the smaller parts of the genome change more rapidly. So if you have these similarities, like we have, like it's like 60% similar protein coding with jellyfish. So if there's larger differences in the most fundamental building blocks, that means that they probably diverged earlier in time. So that's not a contradiction at all, because we can also look at non-coding regions of the DNA. They also have the same nested hierarchies as the more functional portions of the DNA. This isn't an objection. So
have you not seen that phenotypical differences come about with virtually zero mutations, because epigenetics can bring about phenotypical changes?
That's kind of the point. So we accept that the size and proportion of bones can change, right?
Okay.
We accept that the shape and orientation changes.
Pay attention to what makes a species a different species.
We accept the shape and orientation of bones can change.
It's superficial phenotypical differences. One's big, one's small, one's black, one's white, and it's
but the shape can also change, right?
And it's where
shape and orientation.
Say again.
Shape and orientation can change, right?
Yeah.
As it does with the fossil coelacanth. We see here, you say that these are all living fossils, that there is complete stasis and no change between them. But all these things that you're calling all coelacanth have massive changes in the size, shape, orientation, number, and proportion of their bones, yet you call them all the same fossil. And so if we see here the orange portion of the coelacanth on the left, it's the orange portion of its bone goes almost all the way up its forehead. In this, we have the top portion going all the way down to the nose, and the orange portion is just at the tip of the nose. So we can accept pretty drastic changes to shape and orientation, right? As well as these pictures. These are all from the same species. These all have functional fins, right? Size, proportion, shape, and orientation. We can agree that these change over time, right?
Sure.
And it can be inherited. We can also agree that the location and number of these features can also change, right?
Sure.
Okay. And do you agree that the function and chemical composition of bones can change as well, and tissues?
Function?
Yes. So this is a horse evolution that most creationists, all that I've checked into, organizations accept, because they're all grouped in the horse kind. Except, so we have fossils that are horses with 4 toes, fossils that are horses with 3 toes, fossils that are horses with 3 toes but smaller side toes, and fossils with a large central toe, and modern horses which have even larger central toe. Do you agree that this would be possible?
Do you want me to respond to that?
Well, the question is this possible?
Well, of course it's possible. Of course it's possible. That's not in dispute.
Okay. So then this would be the changing of the function of that middle toe there, right? It is now bearing all of the load instead of sharing the load with other fingers, right?
So let me explain real quick
Right? That was a
why.
yes or no question.
No.
No, that's not it. The middle finger is not changing function if it's the only finger now.
No.
If the middle finger is now the entire foot, that hasn't
I'm just
changed
going to
function
keep
of the
saying
finger.
no because you're missing the most important point in this example. The most important point is all that you've talked about, all the big phenotypical changes, like in your coelacanth example, that all happens in real time. It does not take tens of millions of generations. It doesn't take tens of thousands. It doesn't even take hundreds. It can literally happen in 1 or 2 generations. And it's because of the regulatory information. So your horse example here, when you look at the number of toes there, the regulatory information can literally tell the protein coding region to turn on or off in some cases. It can tell it how many times to split for cell division. It can tell it to not split, to split once, to split twice. It's the regulatory information that does that. Now, I'm not making any particular claim here if your first example of 4 toes is actually related to the last example. What I'm pointing out is that functionally speaking, the regulatory information can tell a feature on an animal whether to split or not, whether to express itself or not.
Yeah.
It's the regulatory information, but the regulatory information is not used for distant ancestry. That's the problem. That's a major disconnect.
Why not? If you can change a foot this much, why can't these be related by the same regulatory information, making the legs smaller and the front legs flatter?
Because changing the shape or the number of toes, if the code is already there for the toes to be 2 or 3 or 4 or 1, the point is it cannot change the toes into a wing. It can't change a scale into a feather.
Why?
It can't change a bellows lung into an avian lung.
It changed a toe into a foot.
If I grant that those are actually related, all that actually has to happen there is to tell the number of cell divisions or the amount of fusion that needs to happen, or the expression is turned on or off. That is a far cry from what evolution actually tries to claim for
It's not.
ancient
So what
ancestry.
you're doing here is saying you can walk 10 feet, but you can't walk 20.
That's called an unwarranted extrapolation.
No. If you wanted to call that something, you would call it an inapt analogy. But it's not.
It is
What's preventing a functional hand from flattening out? A functional dinosaur hand from fusing its finger bones?
Nothing. I've already told you that.
Okay, so then you can take an arm and make a wing.
No, you can't. Wings have feathers. They have
admitted to every necessary change.
Taylor, you make it sound like we're denying that change happens. That's not where the center of the argument is.
You've admitted I can walk 10 feet, but you're saying I can't make it 20. So you've admitted that animals can inherit changes in the size, shape, orientation, location, and proportion of their bones, and they change the function and composition of these bones. And yet you're saying this, like, you can't take an arm and make it into a wing, and you give no reason. You just deny it.
No, I gave you really good reasons.
You did.
And
what reason? I didn't hear any reason.
Specific in your claim you just made, you said, I told you could take 10 steps, but not 20. That is not what evolution is doing. Evolution is saying we took 10 steps, therefore we can take 20 billion steps.
Yeah.
That is a very different thing. You're making a completely false analogy there.
Yeah. So if my child inherits my steps, then yeah, we can definitely take 20 billion steps.
No. Because the reason that
steps
the regulatory information is not used for deep time ancestry is because the mutation rate is too fast and it won't tell you the story you want to hear. That's why it's not used.
Sorry, say again, the mutation rate is too fast?
In the regulatory information, for example, parentally inherited DNA is not used in deep time ancestral studies because the mutation rate is too fast to tell the evolutionary story the way you want
it. No, it's too fast if you set that mutation rate as the universal fixation rate. Those are two very different things. A species can diversify at one rate and fixate those changes at a completely different rate.
I'm well aware that there are multiple mutation rates assigned across the animal and plant kingdom. I know that, but the error that you're making there is the mutation rate to which you're alluding is specific to the one that's used in deep time ancestral studies, is specific to the 2% protein coding. It completely ignores the other 98% of the genome, because its mutation rate will not give you a million or tens of million year timeline. And the good case in point is human chromosome, Y chromosome, is very different to chimp chromosome, Y chromosome. It's very different, but human Y chromosome has a high mutation rate. Yet, all humans have very similar Y chromosomes, but it's got a really fast mutation rate, which tells you that deep time has never happened across the human race because it's highly variable, but yet everybody's very, very similar.
Except again, you're ignoring the mutation rate versus fixation rate.
No, I'm telling you that the mutation rate was cherry picked to the 2% coding region, protein coding region. It's cherry picked data. That's what it is.
No, because you're failing to understand why those rates are used as a better indicator, because those are the more fundamental building blocks of life. So the more different the fundamental ones are, that's a better indicator than the regulatory information that decides how long something's fingers are. It's not going to tell us much about how close they were in developing basic skin proteins or pigment proteins or cytochrome C or hemoglobin. You're not going to get much information by comparing the regulatory information of hemoglobin.
Taylor,
but you are going to get more information about deep time if you compare the actual coding regions for hemoglobin.
If you can't tell how the proteins were assembled, you can't tell who they came from. Period.
What does that mean?
You have to know how they were assembled.
You don't. This is why your standard of evidence is completely messed up. Again, you can tell things about events that happened without eyewitnesses and without actually observing that specific thing itself. You can tell that it's similar to other things that are happening today, or similar to processes that we can reenact. That's why if someone falls down the stairs in a certain way, people will throw dummies down the stairs to see if the head can hit the wall at the specific angle or the specific height. We'll never actually have a video of that person falling down the stairs, but a dummy their similar height, we can get very good scientific information from tests on that. But you're saying that we can do that for forensics and murder scenes and history, but we can't do that for life for some reason. For some reason, your standard changes there.
Well, I've been very clear the whole time. The whole point of bringing up the 2% protein coding region and cherry picking that data, the whole point is that it is the epitome. It's the definition of circular reasoning. We know we're all related. Therefore, we'll pick the part that's the most stable. So the protein coding region has to be stable. Otherwise, people would not produce people, and birds would not produce birds, and dogs would not produce dogs would not produce dogs. The protein coding region has to be stable in order to get a human every single time.
So you don't understand what circular reasoning is.
This whole exercise is cherry picking data and circular reasoning to say we know we're related because we'll pick the most stable portion and use that as our clock. So the whole point about stasis, real quick, and I'll hand you the floor back. The whole point about the stasis thing was if you look at an ancient fossil and look at the modern version, I never claimed it was perfect stasis, but it is extreme stasis. In many examples, but the whole point there is if you had the DNA of the ancient example and you could compare it to the modern example, DNA letter for letter, it does not matter what the results are. They won't make sense for deep time. And I'll give you specifically why. If it's very similar, that means millions, tens of millions of years have gone by, but the mutation rate was pretty much frozen. If it's very different, now the problem is you've got almost identical phenotypical features from a completely different genome, and that doesn't make sense either. So
you know what the
neither
difference
scenario
between
works.
mutation and fixation is?
Yes.
What is it?
Does it say that one more time?
What is it?
No, what is fixation?
Yeah,
Is
what
that
is
you're
the
asking?
difference between a fixation of a mutation and the mutation rate?
Specifically, the point here is that you have a fixation rate in a population for the 2% protein coding region only, but there's also a fixation rate for the other 98%, and it's different. They're two different things. We're not disputing that there are mutation rates that can be picked to use. We know that. The problem is that it's cherry-picked data to only use the 2% when ancestry comes from the 98%.
No, it comes from all the percent.
In context,
But
that's
it's
what I'm
not
saying.
cherry picked
But it's
because
the 98%.
why are we comparing?
It's, again, the argument is 98% of the genome dictates the phenotypical differences that help identify species differences.
Yeah,
It's the
they're
98%
comparing
that
the
does
stuff.
that, not the 2%.
They're comparing the stuff that should be more similar. That's not cherry picked. And so you also don't seem to have an understanding of what circular reasoning is, because if we were using the proposition that life is all related, therefore these mutation rates are what they are, and therefore life is all related. That's circular reasoning. But that's not what's happening. And I guess to address the other point you made, the amount of change that occurs in stasis is enough to explain all of evolution. So you admitted all that we need for evolution.
No.
All the size, shape, orientation, location, number changes. The amount that happens within what you call stasis, or the same kinds, is actually an amount that's greater than the kinds because it bridges different kinds. What I showed you about those birds before, let me see if I got it somewhere around here. But the fact that the morphological clusters were being closed actually shows that the amount of change within a kind actually bridges different kinds. So if we have, to explain it better, if we have this amount of change in the blue areas and this amount of change in the purple areas, well, the gap between the blue and the purple areas is actually a smaller gap than the gaps between the members of blues are to each other and the members of the purples are to each other. So the amount of size, shape, orientation, etc. changing between these two supposedly different things is smaller than the amount of change that you already accept can occur within the stasis. So you've already, once you admit, basically, this is you can walk 10 feet but can't walk 20 feet because you've already admitted all the necessary changes can happen. And because those gaps between the different baramins or different kinds are smaller than the gaps of the actual members of the kinds.
So you want me to respond to all that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You pulled up a chart showing some phenotypical differences and similarities between a group of what looked like theropods and birds, right? So back to my original point. You don't have the DNA. You don't have the internal organs. And if you had them and had a full data set, you could easily come to a completely different conclusion than what this very superficial data set looks like.
You can't
And
come to a
so
different conclusion.
one of the problems with this type of data, and I'm not opposed to doing this because it's a convention, so I'm not arguing that people shouldn't do this, but I'm pointing out an extreme weakness with this particular method is that you basically have equal weighting across a broad variety of phenotypical traits. And that is an evolutionary mess, because changing, like in your example earlier, can you flatten an arm into more of a wing shape? That is a very different evolutionary process than changing a feather to a scale. They're not the same thing. And if you put the DNA and the internal organs there and actually weighted them properly to say, okay, it literally, this is not a joke, it literally takes a small handful of mutations to tell a cell to divide once or twice or three times, but it takes a huge number of mutations to tell a scale to turn into a feather. It's
It actually doesn't.
completely different in terms of, even by the basic standards of how temporal distances are calculated in an evolutionary method, it's a completely different amount of time that's required. So you can't weight them all the same in a very simplistic view like that.
You can, one, because dinosaurs already had feathers. So it actually is a completely moot point. But also, the development of feathers is exactly what you're talking about, with cells telling each other, oh, it can regulate to divide this number of times versus this number of times, or in this location versus that location. So, and scientists have done several experiments with messing with the genes of both scales and feathers. So the way that feathers actually develop is literally just growing scale material, but they divide at a certain at different times than the scale does. So basically the regulatory information just tells the scale to keep growing vertically, and for some of the cells within it to die in a certain pattern, and you get a feather. So it is exactly the same principle as you're talking about.
Okay, here's another example of a very incomplete so-called scientific method. This is another really good example of being really incomplete and superficial and cherry-picking the data. So just to be clear, in the young Earth creation paradigm, there is nothing contrary about dinosaurs having feathers. Personally, I don't actually care, but I have a strong intuition that it's just not true. But I just want to be clear on that point, that there's nothing technically contrary to YEC paradigm about dinosaurs having feathers. However, in the vein of this being an incomplete method that you just described, one of the problems with making that conclusion is that birds are warm-blooded creatures that are found across a broad range of climates and temperatures. Why are there not any dinosaurs found in very cold climate environments? If they evolved into birds, that seems like a very natural thing to do, is to predict that you should be able to find dinosaur fossils in what looks like very cold climates, like what birds can exist
in. There are.
Really? Where?
All over the place. The feathers were actually thought to be a way to warm them up. And dinosaurs actually are most likely weakly warm-blooded.
That's not how you determine whether they lived in a supposed cold climate. You look at all of the biota that's associated with their particular fossil location, and that's how you decide whether or not it actually came from a cold climate.
Yeah, the dinosaurs have been found in every continent, so
Yep.
they've lived in pretty much every biome.
Can you show me an example of one where dinosaurs lived in a decidedly cold climate?
Yeah, there's an article. that I just read recently about how dinosaurs lived in cold environments for at least part of the year, and they call them polar dinosaurs. And it's not fossils that are found in Antarctica. Like, you know, we find tons of fossils in Antarctica, but that doesn't mean that the environment of Antarctica was the same back then because of Pangea and all that stuff. They've actually done studies on these environments as they were back then, most likely going through seasons, such as cold in the winter.
So I would be thrilled to death to see if you, I'm not expecting you to just give the source right now, but if you could post a source to share with everybody, that would be awesome. Because here's what I'm going to suggest. If you have a polar dinosaur, so-called, that you called it, I just have to ask, did that fossil have feathers?
I don't know specifically. Yeah, I think they did. And so what it was looking at is southeastern Australia, which at the time, you know, rolling back the whole plate tectonics thing, would have been in like the latitude of which would have had seasons. And that was basically the logic of it. But it doesn't matter if they had feathers or not. There are cold-blooded reptiles today that live in places that have seasons of severe winters. So they just go into stasis usually. Reptiles don't usually migrate at all. They'll go
In other
underground.
words,
They'll just hide in frozen ice. So this is not actually a contradiction to anything.
What you just described is that feathers aren't diagnostic in a dinosaur of cold climate.
Nope.
But you said that they developed them because they're semi-warm-blooded and adapted for cold climate.
That is one possible use of it, because there were nesting dinosaurs discovered in a similar position on their nest to chickens, who also use that action to warm their eggs, and feathers aid in that warming as well. This is why this is the double standards thing that I'm having a tough time with, is we can use these standards of, okay, we know what guns do. We have evidence that there was a gunshot at this crime scene, but for some reason, according to your standards, we can't go, okay, we know what chickens do. We know what they do with their feathers, but we can't extrapolate that to extinct life forms for some reason.
That's not what I said, and you're making another false analogy.
All right, guys.
You keep making claims, but you're not explaining why.
I've been the most specific here about explaining why.
Why is it?
I've explained why 2% protein coding is the only standard that an evolutionist will use, and you didn't even bother mentioning that very important detail.
Because it's not the only standard.
All right, I'm going to jump in here. TRock and Snake, great discussion. I would say it flew by, and we're at about an hour and 15-ish minutes for the discussion. So I think this will be a good place to wrap it up. Now, if there is anything you feel has been left hanging, we do have 5-minute closing statements where you both can wrap up your thoughts and your points and address anything that you feel hasn't been adequately addressed. And so to the audience, you have 10 more minutes until the audience Q&A. And so if you do have a question, again, tonight's topic, is there good evidence for evolution? Tag me. Let me know who the question is for, either Taylor or TRock, and we'll have a solid 30-minute Q&A period. So Taylor, when you're ready, we'll give you the floor for the first closing statement. Let me know when you're good to go. We'll start your timer.
5 minutes, you say?
5 minutes.
Okay. So we had an admission of every single criterion that we would need to bridge every gap in life's history and the fossil record. TRock agreed with me that the size, shape, orientation, location, number, I'm sure there's another one I'm forgetting, of bones and tissues tissues as well can change. And he mentioned on his own volition that they can change rapidly. For example, that these two are considered the same kind by creationists, but one has a unique muscle set that no other mammal or animal on the planet has. So either every member of this kind somehow coordinated with each other to lose this muscle group, or it was evolved. Functional information evolving has also been observed, and he's basically admitted this. He's fine with this, as is every creationist organization. So again, size, proportion, shape, orientation, location, number, function, and chemical composition of bones and tissues are all admitted to change a lot and get inherited. So there's actually no barrier between evolution series like this, because all we're doing is slightly changing the regulation of the basic building blocks. And in this fashion, you can bridge different groups of animals. Creationists have a double standard with this kind of evidence. They have such a high standard for this evidence that, okay, if you didn't check every single conceivable angle, that we just have to throw out the results. There's no appraising of probability or likelihood. But then they turn around and they say that, creationists, this is from Creation Ministries, this article. They claim that the earliest snake fossils are in fact snakes based on jaw fragments alone. So they can sit there and say, look, this evidence we found, these fragments, they look like snake fossils, therefore they were snake fossils. So this is the same thing as saying this crime scene, this murder scene looks like a gang shooting. It has all the evidence and hallmarks of a gang shooting, but we can't throw out the possibility that everyone just simultaneously shot themselves and their guns just magically disappeared in a miracle. We can't rule that out. Therefore, the conclusion that it was a gang drive-by shooting is completely unwarranted, and there's no likelihood at all. And yet they turn around and make the same exact inferences from the evidence when it's convenient for them. Like I said earlier, the baraminology methods were dropped by creationists when inconvenient, because their method of grouping things morphologically started shrinking the more morphological specimens we had, because the amount of observed and accepted change within kind now exceeded the differences between all the different kinds. The amount of change within the cat kind is greater than the amount of change that is needed to bridge them to other carnivore kinds. So we know that the amount of change necessary to bridge all forms of life are observed and admitted by creationists, and yet when it comes down to it, they hold a double standard for that. That's evidence on its own. We can talk about we didn't get to really much of the likelihood of genetics. It's impossible for the nested hierarchies to be the way they are if they were created, because that would require infections, making having the chances greater than the amount of atoms in the universe. But I'll just leave on this point that it was never addressed once in the entire debate, even though I brought it up multiple times, that only evolution can make the sort of predictions and can create technology that we need to classify something as a science. Only evolution can do this. And there was absolutely no pushback on this fact. That is what is the hallmark of a science, whether it can create knowledge, and only evolution can create knowledge on the fossil record, like we've seen predicted from it. Only evolution can create working medicinal technology, predictions about virology, etc.
Okay, Taylor, thank you very much for that closing statement. TRock, whenever you're ready, you have between 5 and 6 minutes for a closing statement as well. The floor is yours. Go ahead.
Excuse me. Okay, I'm going to talk kind of fast here because a lot of points to cover there. I'm going to start. It's one of his more recent comments. Only evolution makes these types of predictions. I actually did directly address that. I plainly demonstrated that it's not a prediction based on unique characteristics of the evolutionary paradigm. It's a matter of following patterns. If we need a functional example of a quote unquote prediction by creation, you don't have to look any further than James Webb Telescope, recent results. Jason Lyle actually has an article that he wrote before the photos were released describing what it is that James Webb would see, and that is clearly formed galaxies way out past what we've ever seen before. And you can go look that up on the internet and find tons and tons of information about what a surprise that was to the evolutionary community. They expected to see galaxies in the formation process, not fully formed. Another one would be the magnetic field strength of Uranus. Another one would be the helium remaining in zircons that are allegedly 1.5 billion years old. And the thing about these predictions is they exclusively rely on young Earth principles, whereas finding tiktaalik between a land animal and an aquatic animal is simply a matter of following, like I said, physical characteristics and a pattern. It has nothing to do with the time. Literally, in Russell Humphrey's equations, you have to plug in the specific amount of time that has passed to produce this result. So, not to mention that most of the fundamental sciences were actually established by creationists, not evolutionists. Creation assumes purpose and intent. Taylor made the claim earlier. He said something along the lines, I don't want to misquote him, but I don't remember word for word what he said. He said something to the effect of, by slightly changing the regulation of the protein coding genes, you can produce different phenotypes. What's the problem with that? Again, the mutation rate in the regulatory genes is very fast compared to what's in the protein coding genes. And so when you do something like Ancestry, like 23andMe or something like that, they use microsatellites that change very fast so that they can distinguish between siblings and cousins and second cousins and that sort of thing, because it happens so fast. Regulatory processes happen basically in real time from one generation to the next. So no billions of years required to provide basic phenotypical differences. What Taylor has done all night long is provided a very heavy bait and switch kind of argument. The bullet example was really classic of that. We can know everything about bullets and guns and how bullets get lodged into walls. That is not the same as knowing that a horse and a fly are related in some way through distant common ancestry. You can't know any of that. It's the difference between high quality data and low quality data. That's the argument that I was making with the human chromosome alleged fusion site, is that if you stop with very superficial characteristics and very superficial assessment with cherry-picked data, yeah, you can come up with some story about how evolution is true. But when you dig deep and do actual, real functioning science, like what I was demonstrating, go find me that 290 base pair sequence in the chimp genome with a very modest amount of degradation or difference between that and the human version. I mean, that is super pristine. To get 29 letters in a row 10 times back to back, that some very closely related semblance of that should appear in the chimp genome. That is how you do proper science. It is what he called, what did he call that? He said that we were, what we're actually doing, he said we were being kind of like selective in how we pick. We had a double standard is what he called it. What he's calling a double standard is actually what creationists are recognizing, the limitations of trying to extrapolate beyond a reasonable data set. That's what we're actually doing. It's not a double standard at all. It's called recognizing the limitations of investigative science into distant history. If you follow the examples we have today and one I have here on screen, if I have about 1 minute left, Donnie, I would like to share my screen real quick. I'll show you this because the whole thing about species and common ancestry for evolution kind of depends on a concept that's not even used to determine temporal distances. So I'm going to zoom this in a little bit, and I'm sorry. This way. There we go.
You've got exactly 30 seconds, TRock.
Okay. Smallmouth bass, bluegill, goggle eye. Most people know what a smallmouth bass is. Some people know what a bluegill is, but most everybody knows what a sunfish is, and then a goggle eye. What are they? I have the the genus species name of each one of them here, and what I'm showing is that they're all given different species, and if you use the evolutionary method to determine temporal distance between these species, you'll come up with a really bogus number because of years, because the smallmouth bass and the bluegill can actually hybridize to produce the goggle eye, but look at the difference in the genus level. They're completely different genuses, which hints in standard evolutionary paradigm that they're distantly related by some significant number of years, in the hundreds of thousands to millions probably. But in reality, they can't be, because the highly mutatable regulatory genes still hybridize. So I'll end there and we can carry on.
Do I sense a future round 2, probably by the end of the summer, on this same topic between Snake and TRock, with maybe a focus on some of these other topics like nested hierarchies? That'd be a good one to focus on. And so it's a comprehensive topic. It's a big topic. I think you both did a fantastic job with the time that we have tonight to discuss it. But I would really personally like to see another round on this topic, maybe by the end of the summer. So with that, I'll give the debaters just a quick 30-second break and go over some reminders. Okay, so we'll be back tomorrow for another debate. This time it'll be a soteriology showdown. Charles Jennings, Lucas Curcio, both excellent debaters, both know their stuff. And so this will be a very scholarly debate. I'm looking forward to it. It'll start at 10 EST. Then the next day, TRock's going to be back. He'll be debating Mark Reed. This is definitely going to be a technical debate, a memorable debate. And so the Genesis flood debate. Is there a scientific evidence for a worldwide flood? I'm looking forward to this one. And I'll give a shout out to a couple of the upcoming debates in June that I'm really looking forward to. And so let's start. We've got Matt. So Matt Naylor from the team, people know him as Raw Matt. He'll be doing a couple debates this summer. These two will be in June. And so this will be Matt and Grayson from the Base Theory YouTube channel, the Great Age of the Earth debate, with a main focus on radiometric dating. So that should be fun. Matt's also going to be debating Mark Reed. Is there scientific evidence for evolution? So same topic that Taylor and TRock debated. That'll be at the end of June. We also have an evolution open mic. Dr. Dino will be here. This will be June 12th. And so I'll get that up on the channel. And so anybody who wants to join, mark that off on your calendar, and we'll have some fun. I'm really excited for this one. So this will be our first debate on this topic. Dr. Robert Sungenis, leading voice in the world of geocentrism. And Grayson, who's done at least a couple debates, or he's done some study on flat Earth and geocentrism and cosmology. So this is going to be a good topic. So Robert Sungenis, Grayson in June, the Great Geocentrism debate. We'll be having a couple informal debates or discussions with Paul Price. And so Paul will be here in June. He'll be having a discussion on the evidence for God with Michael, the Canadian atheist, and then also with Grayson again. And so that should be a solid discussion. And for those who like a good old nature of God debate. We've got Kelly Powers and Carlos Xavier. They'll be debating the specific question: does Matthew 28:19 teach the Trinity is biblical? Now, that's just a snapshot of the overall material we do have on the channel. We've got about 4 to 5 events every week for the next few months for the summer. So if you're not yet subscribed, hit that subscribe button. We're very close to hitting 20,000 subscribers. And if you share around to your friends and family, we'll hit that quickly. So anyways, Snake, TRock, let's get into some questions. Break time is over. Hope you're both feeling refreshed, because we have some great questions for us to engage. And so let's start right at the beginning. Creationist Crybaby is coming at you, TRock. So first question for tonight. TRock, why do you assume that a biochemical process functions only if its components are functioning as we see them today, instead of being built up through natural selection?
That is a really good question about natural selection more than anything. But why? It's the same thing that Taylor was trying to describe. We can see the trend. The trend today is, and one of the points I was trying to bring out is that speciation is dictated by basic phenotypical differences and segregation of populations, neither of which require millions of years. And interestingly, I don't know if Taylor knows this or not, but a lot of professional evolutionists actually do not attribute speciation to natural selection hardly at all. They give it very, very limited scope in its role. So personally, I came to that conclusion a long time ago before I heard an evolutionist say that. But there is a good reason for it. My reasoning is, I don't know for sure, but I think it's probably very similar to theirs. Mine is that, for example, if you have the lion and the zebra scenario where natural selection is supposed to favor the faster zebra, the more well-hidden zebra, whatever the case may be, the lion is going to catch the one that's easier to see or the slower runner, right? And so the faster one's going to pass its genes along, and the mutations are going to get fixed in the population, and poof, you get speciation eventually out of that. What's the problem there is that the lion don't chase the adults that are fast and hide good. They chase the old, decrepit, injured, or the very young babies that haven't got the wherewithal to utilize their genetic ability yet. So what can natural selection do with that? Nothing, because both zebras can live and die just fine. They can have phenotypical differences. They can move from one place on the planet to another, and that is the basis of speciation. And natural selection had nothing to do with it, because both of them can survive simultaneously.
Taylor, floor is yours.
Okay, what's the problem with that? Are the lions eating every single baby zebra? Obviously not, or they'd go extinct. And so this line of thinking just doesn't make any sense. Both the weaklings, or both the, I don't know what both means there actually. But I think it includes the stronger ones that get away from the lions, and the young ones that also get away from the lions. It doesn't matter. You can still have evolution, because some of the babies actually survive. And it's not, again, fitness. This has to be said every time. Fitness is not just being bigger and being stronger. It can be across a whole population. So the thing about zebras is, one of the theories about why they're striped is because, well, the lions can't actually tell the difference between specific zebras now. They all kind of blend together. They don't need to blend in with the actual Sahara. They just need to blend in with each other. So it's just a very poor understanding of what natural selection or fitness actually is. And the fact that not every baby gets taken by the lions, but that is a form of natural selection. If the babies are too slow due to some form of mutation, then that mutation gets taken out of the population, or a whole host of mutations.
Thank you, Snake. TRock, question was for you. You get the last word.
Okay, so Taylor said he didn't understand the line of thinking. Nothing surprises me about that. To do a thorough scientific investigation, you have to link a lot of pieces of logic together, not just a few. He threw, what the theory was about why stripes evolved or whatever. The whole point of the argument is that the lion, it is completely random. If the lion eats the older, decrepit, slow, or injured zebra, he's eaten one that's already passed its genes along. And it could have been a slow zebra or a fast zebra or a striped zebra or a non-striped zebra. It doesn't matter because he's already passed his genes along. So he's already got an opportunity to fix that mutation into the population. If the lion eats the baby zebra, it's completely random which baby he eats because none of them can run very fast. And he's just going to catch the one that's closest by. He could easily catch the fastest one. And now that mutation can't get fixed in the population. Or he can catch the striped one and that one can't get fixed in the population, at least not as fast. So it has a direct impact. But the whole point is natural selection plays a very limited role, but speciation happens very fast. And both of those ideas are contrary to the standard form of the evolutionary argument.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Next question comes in for Snake. Question from Kevin's Biblical Discussions. How can DNA exist without a designer?
Sorry, I got a phone call. Assuming this one's for me, how can DNA exist without a designer? That's a really bad question because it's literally just a logical fallacy. You're just ignorant on it. And so you say, God of the gaps, I don't know what it is, therefore it was magical God. That's a fallacy, so I have to dismiss it, period, or else I'm being irrational. And we don't know. We don't know how DNA got started. There are lots of guesses. There are, and they're working on that. But that doesn't mean that therefore it had to have been a designer. So this is a really, really bad question because it's literally a logical fallacy. So I don't understand why people try this type of reasoning. We didn't understand how does lightning exist without Thor? Well, how does lightning exist without Zeus? Well, we didn't know, but it was a fallacy back then when they said it. And then science eventually figured it out. So this is the point that I was trying to thrust with the fact that evolution actually creates technology. This is actually has nothing to do with evolution. This is a biogenesis. But the pursuit of trying to find a naturalistic explanation has gotten us new fields of chemistry and whole swaths of knowledge of how things happen and what chemicals can form naturally, how they form naturally. But the assumption that God created the DNA or these biomolecules has gotten us precisely no knowledge whatsoever. So that's the problem with that kind of question.
Okay, thank you, Snake. TRock, floor is yours.
Okay, I'm going to try and kind of address the question first and then some of what Taylor just said. But how can DNA exist without a designer? So this is one of the things I mentioned earlier. Evolution always starts at the wrong end of the equation, whereas creation always starts at the beginning where you need to start. So in the case of DNA, the whole point of this debate is there good evidence for evolution? You have to grant the evolutionist a planet, stars, space, time, biology. You have to grant them everything to start with before they can even have a discussion. So DNA, the problem with DNA, of course, whether you're talking about RNA world or DNA, and there's some new hypotheses being floated around out there that are equally likely to fail as an explanation. But DNA is extremely sensitive to temperature and chemical environment. So naturalistic processes and randomness that Taylor tried to say can do a lot more than intelligence. And yet everything the scientists are trying to do applies intelligence and a short amount of time. But evolution isn't about intelligence in a short amount of time. It's about randomness and a whole lot of time. So when he makes the claim evolution creates technology, no, Taylor, evolution can't create technology, because if it could, you'd have to wait millions of years for it to develop. And you would have to throw out the intelligent scientists that are doing it. Instead, scientists apply intelligent methods and try to get the results as quickly as possible. It's the antithesis of evolution creating technology.
Okay, thank you, TRock. Taylor, question was for you. You get the last word.
Yeah, so no, there is actually no intelligent design going into this technology. So for the actual evolved technology itself, you are dead wrong about that, as usual. And what they do is they put it through mutations. Okay, so we can't create this kind of complexity with intelligent design. As for the technology that actual biological evolution can create, that's more usually medical technology. But your main objection to this is it's too fast, which again is displaying your conflation of fixation and mutation. There, it doesn't matter if a thing can change quickly. That means that it couldn't have been changing for millions of years somehow. That's really bad critique, because one, there is a filter that changes that limits how many changes can actually stay in the population. So there were a lot more changes that had occurred to these populations that never stuck in the population. And as for the zebra example, no, it's not completely indiscriminate. The slower babies will get taken, then the faster babies will get taken. And so, yeah. And then to address your other points, you don't understand what laboratories do or what isolating variables are, because intelligent input, so-called, by scientists is just saying we're isolating the variables so we can observe what happens naturally, and the fact that we're trying to not get our variables mixed up. That's actually removing human guesswork from the equation. That's how science actually works. And so there's a problem with saying we don't know, therefore God did it, as to this original question. The answer is we don't know how DNA exists, but it's still inappropriate to say God did it, because it's also inappropriate to just say nature did it, because nature can do anything that we see. If that was the scientific answer, it would be the exact same thing as you saying God did it, and we're saying, well, nature can do it, and we've done exactly as much work as you have. Instead, scientists actually try and figure out how nature might have done it, and that process actually yields knowledge on the subject of chemistry. You have yielded precisely zero knowledge on any field, chemistry or not, from the assumption that nature can't do it.
10 seconds.
And
okay,
I can see.
All right, thank you, TRock and Taylor. Okay, next question now is another one for you, TRock. Question from Creationist Crybaby. TRock, we don't find mammals in Devonian strata or human fossils with dinosaurs in Jurassic strata. Why is the correlation between fossils and radiometric dating so consistent?
Okay, if I grant that it's as consistent as you say it is, which it's not, if I were to grant that, the Earth has about 200 million square miles of surface area. In a global flood, the expectation is not to mix everything up like you threw it in a mixing bowl with a blender. That is not a realistic physical expectation of a global flood. For the life of me, I cannot figure out why evolutionists haven't figured this out, why that should be the case. But the point is that we do expect global scale patterns. And so when you don't find mammals in the Devonian strata, this is a very long conversation, but I'll try and keep this brief for the sake of the program. We don't find mammals in Devonian strata because Devonian strata appears to be more like a coastal environment. The flood started with 40 days of rain. Most mammals go to the forest when it rains. A few small ones will burrow and do some other things, hide in, low shrub, that kind of thing. But the majority of them, especially the larger mammals that you really see separated by supposed vast amounts of geological time, they tend to go to the forest, like the great apes or the deer, the cattle, the horses. That's what they do. And so in a global flood, when you've got very large scale water movement, you expect to pick up the coastal environment first and deposit it first and not mix it up like a blender with the mountainous regions, for example. So we expect to see a certain amount of patternistic deposition like that in a large scale. As for the radiometric dating, it's not as consistent as you would like to make it sound, for sure, because the isochron method that was mentioned earlier is bent on this whole idea of a homogeneous relationship across the parent daughter and stable daughter elements. However, I've argued before, and I've not brought this out a lot in this particular venue, but one of the problems with that line of thinking has to do with if you really wanted to demonstrate the consistency of radiometric dating or its validity, what you would do is pick two completely different methods, like uranium, lead, and then rubidium, strontium, and you would independently do those dating checks and compare them. And if the method were accurate, you would do that with as many as 3 or 4 different methods and get the same data across all 4 of them. That would be the strongest case you could make. But instead, they go to the isochron method, which is a decidedly weaker version because there is a whole slew of terminology in the open literature about mixing line, false isochron, mixing isochron. I literally found like 9 or 11 different terms to describe that because you get this false signature of what an isochron is. You would not get that if you had 4 different methods all converged on the exact same date in the exact same strata, but those methods have specific time frames that they're assigned to for their usage, and there is very minimal overlap between them. So that's pretty much your answer.
Okay, thank you, TRock. Taylor, floor is yours. I think you might be on mute, but it looks like it's from your end, Snake.
Yeah, so this is a real quick look at how all these different types of radiometric dating, they all converge on the same numbers. Now, that's mathematically impossible if they're all just doing crazy different things and they aren't reliable. Okay, so what else was in this? Let's start it on to address the original question. We know what floods actually look like. Again, this is going back to the basic methodology. We know the typical presentation of this thing that happens, so we know that if it happened in the past, it would look similar. Creationists just kind of throw this method away when convenient and accept it when it is convenient. That's the double standard. We know what floods actually look like. They do mix up everything they come in contact with, from the shore to the inner parts. They take stuff from the shore and they put it inland. So there's no reason to think that if the flood was bigger or more wide scale, that it would suddenly become sentient and know what species is in it. We should not expect floodwaters to know what species are it's flooding and to sort them by species. And it's not sorted by ability or anything like that, because we see animals with the same abilities, with similar phenotypes and similar ecological niches, sorted in different strata in the same physical location, except, the sea animals from one time are at the bottom, and then you have a bunch of different niches in that same layer. And then several layers up, you also have more deep sea animals, and in the same layer, other types of ecological niches, because they're from the same time, not the same place. So the problem is, you claim that you can predict these types of patterns. You can't. There's no hydrological sorting that fits the actual pattern. You can ad hoc say, well, it fits a couple of patterns, then you have to change the method to fit a couple more patterns, but you have no universal fitting of the patterns. Only evolution can predict the whole pattern. Only evolution has been able to predict the patterns, because only evolution has the right pattern, which is inheritance relationships. So if you could predict these patterns with any accuracy whatsoever, with creationism, you'd be able to, and there'd be a history of creationist methods predicting certain animals are in certain locations, but there aren't. There's not one example. They don't even try. You can't make these predictions. Creationism never made these predictions, and they continue to not even try to make these predictions. And only evolution has done it and has been quite successful at doing it. And so that is what that's what scientific evidence and confirmation looks like.
Okay, thank you, Taylor. TRock, you get the last word. Go ahead.
Okay, two particular things that Taylor said that let me know he really does not know what a proper scientific investigation should look like. We know what floods look like. No, Taylor, you don't know what a global flood looks like unless you've seen one. The difference, there is a big physical model difference between a local flood and a global flood. And it's fairly easily, I would like to show a graphic, but I don't have one prepared, but I'll describe it. It'll be super easy to understand. In a local flood, the water might be 20 feet deep, but the car, the horse, whatever, might be 3-4 feet tall. So now you've got a 5-to-1 ratio in the depth of the water to the height of the object that's being mixed in the flood, right? 5-to-1 ratio. That's not a huge difference. What that means in a physical model is turbidity currents should be very high in a local flood. In a global flood, the scale looks very different. It looks more like 300 meters deep water and a 3, 4, 5 foot tall object, whether it's an animal or whatever the case may be. So now you have 100-to-1 ratio of water depth to the objects that are supposed to be mixed. That means the turbidity has to be very low. Low turbidity cannot mix the way high turbidity can. There is an entire science, has nothing to do with origins, on this whole understanding of water depth, obstructions, whether it's pipe walls or whatever the case may be, and it can be water. It's called fluidization in the industry that I work in, because it's not water, it's actually dry powder, but it's called fluidization. And there's an entire science behind understanding how turbidity currents form. So when you say no hydrological sorting fits the pattern, it's because you don't even know what hydrological sorting is supposed to do with a given scale. That's very obvious that you have not made a proper analysis of that. And I'm not, and to be clear here, the whole point of this debate is there good evidence for evolution? This argument is not good evidence because you have no valid scientific method for making this comparison before you make that claim.
Okay, thank you for the final word, TRock. Next question comes in from Tanya Brown. Thank you very much for the question, Tanya. Question is for Snake. Do failed predictions count against a theory? Example, neutrality of synonymous mutations, randomness of mutations, mutation/speciation rates, earlier than first thought uselessness of appendix. Go ahead, Taylor.
Your examples are mostly really bad. But yes, failed predictions do count against a theory. That's why things change in science, unlike in religion, where we're confronted with new information, we change it. Usually what happens is it's not like, oh, that didn't work, time to throw it all out. No, we shift things slightly. This is exactly evolution itself. This is how evolution works on AI programs is you don't rewrite the entire program every time it goes through a round of changes. Each round of changes is a slight change to it. It's selected, and it goes through a round of millions and thousands of small changes. Then the right one is selected, and then it goes through small changes again. So it's not that you have to throw out the entire theory every time something doesn't go wrong. You change it slightly, and if you change it slightly a bunch of times and nothing works, then you go back to the drawing board. But what happens in evolution is, okay, let's go to the examples. Neutrality of synonymous mutations. So that's a bad example because synonymous mutations are basically neutral. There are some examples where there are mostly precisely neutral. There are some examples where they're only mostly neutral. So what we do is we don't say, okay, time to throw out evolution. No, we say, oh, well, why is it affecting some of these slightly and some of them not at all? So that just refines the theory. It doesn't throw out the theory. Randomness and mutations, they are basically random. There's literally no such thing as true randomness. So it's really just a mathematical concept. There are certain places of the genome that do mutate more than others, but again, mathematically it is random. Mutation and speciation rates, I'm not sure what that's supposed to be. Failed prediction. But again, if we predict a certain mutation rate for certain species and then it turns out to be something different, we don't go, okay, throw out evolution. No, we just go, oh, we just add in the new knowledge into the theory. So usefulness of appendix or uselessness of appendix. So the concept of vestigial structure was never, even from its inception, uselessness, but it was only that the vestige has changed function and lost a previous function. It doesn't mean that it's functionless or useless. But if we go, I don't know what that appendix is for, and then we discover what the appendix is for, then we just add that in. It doesn't overturn anything. So your examples are bad. It has to. So if the baseline theory is able to predict things like the fossil record, we keep that baseline. We change a little bit of the specifics if those don't work, and then if the specifics start working again, we stick with those specifics, such as, okay, well, they didn't know what type of reptiles birds came from. Some people thought they came from non-dinosaur archosaurs. Some people thought they came from birds. The more data we get, the more the bird theory or the dromaeosaur theory becomes viable. So we don't throw out all of evolution. We throw out the archosaur, the non-dinosaurian archosaur, the part of the theory. You can throw away parts, keep parts.
Okay, thanks for the response, Taylor. TRock, floor is yours.
Okay, that was a really good question, and it actually kind of highlights some of the arguments I was making earlier. But so mutation, speciation rates. Yeah, short answer, do failed predictions count against the theory? Absolutely they do, and evolution fails on the most critical predictions that it tries to make. Taylor kind of very well described that they just change the story whenever the data contradicts what they previously thought. That is the nature of evolution. Just change the story, but it's still true. How is it still true if you had to change the story? It wasn't. But in this particular question, mutation rates, one of the points I wanted to bring out was there is a calibration method that's used that uses fossils to calibrate mutation rates. And so anytime you find a fossil and you assign an age and say, okay, this is first appearance of this particular organism, and then you use that as, say, a index fossil or a calibration standard, either one. And then later, and then you develop a method based on that idea. And then later you find basically the identical fossil, but in a quote unquote younger or older layer. Now what happens? It doesn't matter. If you find it in an older layer, what happens is now you have to adjust your calibration standard or throw it out and find a new one. And so in this light, you can see how unfalsifiable evolution really is, because as soon as they find a contradiction to one of their predictions, in other words, it failed, they'll just change the story and say they're still right. I find that logically completely untenable. And to highlight this, part of this whole point about mutation rates and how you might try and calibrate a mutation rate via fossil appearance, somebody in the comments, and I'm going to quote what they said, but I don't want to call anybody's name out. They said, nah, speciation can happen fast, usually does not happen fast. Here's the problem with this evolutionary thinking that young Earth creationists have to really get a hold of. And that is that in the young Earth paradigm, people are always present on the planet with the animals affecting the speciation rate. So yeah, you can look at a population of zebras in Africa and say that their speciation rate is very slow because we leave them alone and don't touch them today. In the last, say what you want, 50, 80, 100, 200 years, we leave them alone and try and let them develop naturally. But in real history, people move animals all over the planet all the time. So we're back to what defines a species. If you reproductively isolate it, you can do that in minutes, literally, certainly in days or weeks, but people move animals and plants all over the planet all the time and reproductively isolate them. And phenotypical differences, like the difference in size, the difference in color, whatever the case may be, they happen within single generations. So the 4,400 year timeline given from the flood, if you can produce a Chihuahua from a population of wolves in a few hundred years, the rest of the speciation that's happened on the planet is a no-brainer for 4,400 years. So yeah, again, historical practices of humans falsify evolutionary predictions.
Okay, thank you for the response, TRock. Snake, question was for you. You get the last word. Go ahead.
All right, so you say, how is it true if you change the story? And I'm just going to call it out. This is intentionally dishonest. You know that it's just refining the theory. It's not, but you're presenting it as if the entire thing is just going back to the drawing board and changing fundamentally. You know what you're doing. So very disappointing. But it doesn't change wildly. It doesn't. So for an analogy, we've got Ted, and we think he murdered someone, and so we have pretty good evidence. We found his DNA at the crime scene or something that physically ties him there. Okay, but we don't know what day he did it. We find out he got an alibi for Sunday, even though previously our big theory was, oh, he did it on Sunday. There was a big game on Sunday, so there would have been people inside watching the game, so we would have had covered a strike, less people on the street. Whatever. Turns out he has an alibi for Sunday. Okay, well, so we have to find evidence for a different day. But all the evidence that still points to him being the murderer is still the same. So we just change what day we're going to investigate what he did. Same thing for evolution. Oh, okay, well, turns out that natural selection still exists, but there are other forms of selection that aren't natural selection. And sometimes the drift is there isn't actually any selection. It's just random drift of traits. Okay, well, it doesn't mean we get rid of selection itself. So this is, at this point, you should know better than to try and that kind of tactic.
All right. Thank you for the final word, Taylor. That is about 35 minutes for the Q&A. So what we'll do is wrap it up there. Again, it's been a thorough debate. Taylor and TRock, I thank you for your time. Definitely a huge topic. evidence for evolution. So hopefully we'll get another one in there on this topic and focus on different points. So let's get some final words, final thoughts before we completely wrap it up for the night. Before we do, though, to the audience, thank you for all the questions, the engagement. We've had quite a lively live chat tonight. So why don't we start with Taylor? Thanks again for doing this. Tons of fun tonight. Get some final words, final thoughts.
Yeah, I think that we discovered that the pattern holds true, that there actually is no consistent standard for what is considered good evidence by pseudoscientists. It's just fake skepticism, and by that I mean they're highly skeptical of something with a high degree of evidence because that we can say that the evidence doesn't have 110% reliability, therefore it has 0% reliability. And but then they turn around and say, oh, well, there was a book with absolutely no confirmation of any eyewitness testimony. And even if it was, it's still the worst form of evidence possible. But we're going to accept that as 100% truth and not even question that. That is the mark of pseudoscience. So, and that's what we saw today is an unequal standard of evidence, an unreasonably high standard of evidence for things that have a standard that they accept for other things like murder cases or history, and an entirely way too loose standard of evidence for other things like religious texts. So I am trying to call for a consistent standard of evidence. I have used every known method in the book to show that our standards are consistent and reliable. So, yeah.
All right, Taylor, thank you for the final words, final thoughts. To anybody in the audience that wants to see more from Snake Was Right, do check the description box for the relevant links. Okay, TRock, thank you as well for doing this debate. Let's get some final words, final thoughts from you. And again, thanks for your time.
Okay, thank you. It was a really interesting discussion to me. I think I highlighted very well what the problem is with evolution. Is there good evidence? The entire paradigm is built on a very superficial view of data. I think I brought that out very well with the human chromosome 2 fusion and looking for more than just some superficial similarities. Take a deeper dive. Other examples, cherry pick data. How do you determine temporal distance between species? Well, we'll only use the super slow stuff that proves our point for us and ignore the very fast mutation rates in the actual control of the protein development. It's cherry pick data. It's very plain that you have to avoid a deep dive into statistical methodology in order to prove evolution. Everything about it says that speciation can happen fast. People have a direct impact on it. Not only do we move things all over the planet, we also directly impact the environment in which the animals and plants live. So, and again, that has a direct impact on speciation as well. Methodology, it's methodology over and over. They keep making the claims, trying to claim the scientific high ground of having a more consistent method. No, you don't. You have a very shallow method that ignores the limitations of a historical investigation. Creation is bent on people knowing what they saw in the past and being reliable eyewitnesses. And ironically, or not ironically, depending on how you want to look at it, science is the exact same thing. You rely on the reliability of a given scientist and his conclusions. He's still an eyewitness. You still have to take his word for it until somebody else comes up with a different idea and changes it and says, oh, that guy was wrong. And then you've just got a new eyewitness and you're just repeating the process. But anyway, I'll stop there. It was a great discussion. hopefully we'll get to do this again in the future, but maybe we can nail it down to something a little more specific and not so broad stroke. We'll see.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Maybe we can pick ahead of time 3 specific lines of evidence to discuss, and then we basically just focus on those. Looks like we got our surprise judge here for the end of the debate to decide who won. Snake, your dog, I think is going to judge the debate, and so good to have him. And so, who won the debate, Judge?
She's staying silent. I'm not sure that's a good thing.
She's
I'll have to
camera
retrain
shy.
her. Yes, she's trying to escape now.
All right. All jokes aside, excellent debate. It flew by. I mean, we're 3+ hours. So again, Taylor, TRock, thank you for your time. To the audience, thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you for all the questions, feedback, input. Always appreciated. And a reminder, we will be back for the next 2 nights with another couple great debates. Tomorrow, Soteriology Showdown. And then the next day, the Genesis Flood debate with TRock and Mark Reed. All right. With that, Standing for Truth is out. God bless all.